Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Indianapolis was already 2 hours behind me when I decided to skip the interstate and take the back roads home that October evening. I'd just finished a job interview at a pharmaceutical company, my third that month since getting laid off. And honestly, the thought of sitting in rush hour traffic while replaying another rejection in my head seemed unbearable. Being 29 and starting over from scratch wasn't part of the plan, but neither was the factory closure that left half my town unemployed, so here I was, choosing random county roads through rural Indiana just to feel like I had some control over something. The cornfields rose up on both sides like canyon walls, dry and rustling in that late harvest way that makes everything sound like whispers. I'd lived in Fort Wayne my whole life, but these particular backroads were new to me, each turn revealing another stretch of identical stalks that seemed to go on forever, broken only by the occasional weathered barn or grain silo standing against the dimming sky. My phone battery was at 12% when I noticed the GPS had stopped updating 20 minutes ago. The little blue dot frozen somewhere near a town called Millbrook that I'd never heard of. The screen showed 6:52 p.m., and the October sun was already sinking behind the corn, throwing long shadows across the dirt road I'd somehow ended up on. I kept telling myself the next intersection would bring me back to pavement, back to civilization. But each turn just led deeper into the maze of agricultural roads that probably only made sense to the farmers who'd been driving them for generations. The Nissan Altima wasn't exactly built for this terrain. Every pothole sent a worrying creak through the suspension, and dust was billowing up behind me in thick clouds that caught the dying light. When the road narrowed to barely more than a tractor path, corn stalks scraping against both sides of my car, with a sound like fingernails on metal, I finally admitted to myself that I was completely, utterly lost. The engine started making the noise around 7:15, just as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the horizon. It began as a subtle clicking, like a playing card and bicycle spokes, but within minutes it had evolved into this grinding metal-on-metal sound that made my chest tight with panic. The temperature gauge was creeping toward the red zone, and wisps of steam were starting to curl up from under the hood, visible in the beams of my headlights that now provided the only illumination on this forgotten stretch of dirt. I pumped the brakes, feeling the car shudder and resist until I finally came to a stop in what seemed like the middle of absolute nowhere. The silence that followed when I turned off the ignition was complete. No distant highway noise, no dogs barking, not even the sound of farming equipment. Just the ticking of hot metal cooling and the endless rustling of corn that surrounded me on all sides, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows even with my high beams on. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at my phone as it searched desperately for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The battery dropped to 11% while I watched, and I realized I needed to save what little power remained in case I found a spot with coverage. My hands were trembling, not from cold but from that special kind of fear that comes when you realize exactly how alone and unprepared you are. The nearest town I could remember passing was at least 40 minutes back, and that was when the car was actually running. I popped the hood release and stepped out into the October night, immediately hit by how much colder it had gotten once the sun went down. The air smelled like dried corn husks and diesel fuel, and underneath that, something else. Maybe fertilizer. Maybe just the scent of soil that had been baking all day and was now releasing its heat into the darkness. The hood was too hot to touch at first, and when I finally got it propped open, a cloud of steam billowed out, making me stumble backward into the dirt road. I knew absolutely nothing about cars beyond checking oil and adding windshield fluid, another life skill I'd always relied on others to handle. The engine block was making these pinging sounds as it cooled, and I could see fluid dripping steadily onto the ground, creating a dark puddle that looked black in the beam of my phone's flashlight. That's when I noticed it, a pinpoint of light moving through the corn, maybe 200 yards away, swaying slightly like someone walking with a flashlight. Relief flooded through me so fast I actually laughed out loud. Thank God, I thought. A farmer checking his fields, or maybe someone else whose car had broken down earlier. I raised my arm and was about to shout when something made me hesitate. The light wasn't moving along the rows like you'd expect from someone walking between planted corn. It was cutting straight through, stalks snapping and rustling, heading directly toward me. I stood there next to my dead car, watching that light get closer, and every instinct I had started screaming that something was wrong. Who walks through corn like that at night? The stalks are planted in rows specifically so you can walk between them during harvest. But this person, if it was a person, was bulldozing straight through like the corn wasn't even there. The sound reached me then, that distinctive crack and swoosh of breaking stalks, getting louder with each passing second. I turned in a slow circle, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing in the middle of this dirt road, with my car's headlights creating a bubble of visibility that probably made me look like a lighthouse in an ocean of darkness. There were no farmhouses visible in any direction, no distant porch lights or barn security lamps, just walls of corn that could have been hiding anything. The light stopped moving for a moment, maybe 100 yards away now, and I could swear whoever was holding it was watching me, evaluating, deciding something. My mouth went dry as I tried to call out a greeting, but the words died in my throat when the light started moving again. Faster this time, with purpose. The sound of breaking corn stalks grew louder, more violent, like someone was running through them now instead of walking. I scrambled back into my car, slamming the door and hitting the lock button so hard my finger hurt. The rational part of my brain kept saying this was probably just a farmer, maybe angry about someone being on his property. But farmers don't move like that through their own fields. They don't destroy their own crops. Through my windshield, I could see the light getting closer, maybe 50 yards now, and I could make out the shadowy outline of corn stalks falling away from whatever was pushing through them. My phone showed 9% battery when I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect. Just that horrible beeping sound that means no signal, not even for emergency calls. Then the light went out. Just like that, complete darkness where it had been, and the sound of breaking corn stopped too. The silence was worse than the noise had been because now I had no idea where they were or what they were doing. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, breathing so hard the windows were starting to fog up, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my pulse in my ears. A minute passed, then two, and I was just starting to think maybe they'd given up and left when something slammed into the passenger side of my car, hard enough to rock it on its suspension. I couldn't help the scream that ripped out of me as I jerked away from the door, my elbow hitting the horn which blared out into the darkness. Through the fogged passenger window, I could barely make out a shape, human-sized but wrong somehow, just standing there, perfectly still. Then came the sound that still wakes me up at night. Fingernails slowly dragging across the glass, deliberate and patient, like someone testing how strong it was. The scratching moved around the car methodically. Passenger window, rear passenger, back windshield, then stopping at the driver's side, right next to where I was hunched against the center console trying to make myself as small as possible. This close, even through the fogged glass I could see more details that made my whole body go rigid with terror. The person was wearing what looked like a medical gown, the thin kind they give you at hospitals, completely inappropriate for the cold October night. Their hair was long and matted, hanging in clumps that might have been blonde once but now looked gray with dirt or worse. But it was the eyes that made me bite down on my knuckle to keep from screaming again, wide open, unblinking, staring at me through the window with an intensity that felt like being studied by something that had forgotten how to be human. They raised one hand and placed it flat against the glass, and I could see dirt caked under those long fingernails, what might have been dried blood on their wrist. They tilted their heads slowly, like a dog hearing a strange sound, never breaking eye contact. I fumbled for my phone with numb fingers, desperate enough to try 911 again even though I knew it wouldn't work. 7% battery now. The figure outside started making sounds, not words exactly, more like attempts at words, these wet, gurgling noises that might have been speech if their throat wasn't damaged somehow. They kept tapping on the window with one finger, gentle and rhythmic, like they were trying to communicate in code. That's when I noticed the medical bracelet on their wrist, the plastic kind with printed information. Though I couldn't read it through the fog and darkness, a horrible thought crept into my mind. What if this person had escaped from somewhere, maybe a psychiatric facility or hospital? Indiana has several state facilities and someone in a medical gown wandering rural roads at night. But that didn't explain how they'd moved through the corn, or why they seemed to be enjoying this, because I swear I could see the corners of their mouth pulling up in something that wasn't quite a smile but wanted to be. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the figure stepped back from my car, disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights' reach. For a moment, I dared to hope they were leaving, but then I heard the trunk pop open. I'd locked the doors but forgotten the trunk release was broken. It had been that way for months, just another repair I couldn't afford. The car shifted as weight settled into the trunk area, and I could hear them rummaging through my emergency kit, metal clanking against metal. The tire iron, they'd found the tire iron. Panic shot through me like electricity as I turned the ignition key, pumping the gas pedal and pleading with the dead engine to somehow miraculously start. Nothing but clicks and the wheeze of a motor that had given up. The trunk slammed shut, and footsteps circled back to my door, slow and measured. Then came the first hit, the tire iron smashing into my side mirror, sending plastic and glass spraying across the dirt. They weren't trying to break in yet, just showing me they could, demonstrating what was about to happen. I did the only thing I could think of, laid on the horn and didn't let up. The blaring sound split the night, echoing off the corn and hopefully, reaching someone, anyone who might call the police. The figure outside actually stumbled backward, hands going to their ears, that grotesque almost smile turning into a grimace of pain or anger. They swung the tire iron at my windshield but missed, hitting the hood instead with a metallic clang that left a dent I could see even in the darkness. My phone battery hit 5% as I kept my palm pressed on the horn, watching this person in a hospital gown rage against my car, swinging the tire iron wildly now, no longer methodical but furious. They tried to scream something over the noise, but it came out as more of that liquid gargling, and I realized with sick certainty that something was definitely wrong with their throat. Maybe self-inflicted, maybe the reason they'd been institutionalized in the first place. The horn kept blaring and I kept pressing, even as my ears rang and my head pounded, because stopping meant silence, and silence meant they'd start working on getting inside again. Then I saw them, headlights cutting through the darkness from the direction I'd come, bouncing over the rutted dirt road. The figure in the hospital gown saw them too, their heads snapping toward the approaching lights with animal-like alertness. They dropped the tire iron and, without any hesitation, turned and crashed back into the corn, vanishing into the stalks as suddenly as they'd appeared. The gurgling sounds faded quickly, swallowed by the rustling maze of dried corn that seemed to close behind them like water. I kept the horn going until the vehicle, a massive John Deere green pickup, pulled up beside me, an older man with a gray beard rolling down his window with a concerned, confused expression. I finally let go of the horn, my palm throbbing, ears ringing in the sudden quiet. The farmer, because that's what he was, asked if I was okay, said he'd been checking his irrigation equipment 2 fields over when he heard the horn going crazy. I tried to explain about the person in the hospital gown, pointing at the smashed mirror, the dents in my car, but my words came out jumbled and hysterical. He believed me though, told me there'd been an escape from Logansport State Hospital earlier that day, some patient with a history of violence who'd injured 2 orderlies getting out. The police had been searching the main roads, but nobody thought to check these back farm routes. He called it in on his CB radio while I sat there shaking, then waited with me for 40 minutes until the state police arrived with their dogs and searchlights. They found the tire iron right where it had been dropped, found footprints and torn fabric on a corn stalk, but the person was gone, swallowed up by miles and miles of agricultural land. The police took my statement, arranged for a tow truck, gave me a ride to a motel in the nearest town. They caught the patient 3 days later, hiding in an abandoned grain silo near Lafayette, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration. I never learned their name or what they'd done to end up in that hospital, and honestly, I didn't want to know. What I do know is that I haven't driven anywhere without a charger cable since, and I take the interstate now, always the interstate, no matter how bad the traffic is. The farmhouse came cheap because nobody wanted to drive 40 minutes just to get groceries. That suited me fine after the divorce papers went through in August. 37 and starting fresh seemed easier when the nearest neighbor lived 2 miles down the gravel road. The property stretched maybe 5 acres total, most of it taken up by corn that the previous tenant had planted but never harvested. By the time I moved in that September, those stalks stood almost 7 feet tall, creating a dense green wall that ran right up to my backyard. The realtor, Nancy something or other, kept apologizing about the unkempt field, promising the owner would have it cleared before winter. I told her not to worry about it. The rustling sound at night actually helped me sleep, like white noise from nature instead of those machines people buy in the city. The first signs appeared maybe 3 weeks after I settled in. I'd gone out one morning to drink coffee on the back porch, watching the sun climb over those endless rows of corn, when I spotted a crumpled McDonald's wrapper near where the grass met the field, then a Marlboro butt, still fresh enough that the filter hadn't yellowed from rain. My first thought was teenagers, probably local kids who'd found a spot to smoke where their parents wouldn't catch them. God knows I'd done the same thing at their age, sneaking behind the gymnasium with stolen cigarettes. The muddy footprint on my deck bothered me more, but October had been wet, and delivery drivers never watched where they stepped. I grabbed a trash bag, picked up the litter, and made a mental note to mention it to Nancy next time she called to check how I was settling in. Kids would be kids, and eventually they'd get bored and find somewhere else to hang out. A week passed before I found the makeshift bed. I'd been walking along the field's edge, looking for my cat Brutus, who liked to hunt mice in the tall grass, when I noticed how the corn stalks bent inward about 20 feet from my bedroom window. Not broken, just carefully pushed aside to create a narrow tunnel. Curiosity got the better of me, and I ducked into the opening, pushing through the dense leaves that scratched at my arms. The smell hit me first, stale sweat mixed with something chemical, like old cologne trying to mask body odor. Someone had flattened maybe 6 feet of corn stalks into a rough oval, creating a hidden pocket completely invisible from the outside. Empty beer cans lined one edge. A ratty sleeping bag lay crumpled in the corner, still damp from the morning dew. But what made my throat close up was the collection of cigarette butts arranged in a neat little pyramid, all Marlboros, all facing the same direction, toward my house. The logical part of my brain kept insisting this was still teenagers, maybe some kid who'd gotten kicked out and needed a place to crash. But teenagers didn't organize their trash like that. Teenagers didn't position themselves with a perfect sightline to my bedroom window, where the corn had been bent just enough to create a gap no bigger than a fist. I backed out of that space, my shirt catching on the rough stalks, and walked straight into my house to call the sheriff's department. The deputy who showed up, a young guy named Brandon who couldn't have been older than 25, walked through the space with me, took some photos, and promised they'd increase patrols. He suggested motion lights for the backyard and maybe some cameras if I could afford them. The way he kept checking his phone and glancing at his watch told me everything. Weird trash in a cornfield didn't exactly qualify as an emergency in his book. I installed the motion lights that same afternoon, driving to the hardware store in town and spending money I didn't really have on 4 industrial-strength floodlights. The clerk, an older man with grease under his fingernails, helped me pick out the brightest ones they had, the kind that would blind you if you looked directly at them. While I was there, I grabbed a deadbolt for the back door and one of those wooden dowels to jam in the sliding glass door track. The installation took me until dark, up and down the ladder with a drill that kept slipping in my sweaty palms. Every rustle from the corn made me whip around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the field stayed empty, just endless rows swaying in the evening breeze. That night, the lights triggered constantly. A raccoon at midnight, wind-blown leaves at 2, a possum around 4. Each time that harsh white light flooded my yard, I'd jolt awake and peer through the blinds, scanning the illuminated grass for footprints, for movement, for anything that would prove I wasn't going crazy. The silence lasted 5 days. 5 days of motion lights catching nothing but animals. 5 days of checking that spot in the corn to find it undisturbed. 5 days of almost convincing myself that whoever it was had been scared off by the deputy's visit. Then, on Saturday night, all 4 lights went out at once. Not triggered, just dead like someone had cut the power. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the screen stayed black no matter how many times I pressed the button. The landline in the kitchen gave me nothing but silence. Even my laptop, which had been charging on the counter, wouldn't turn on. I stood in my dark kitchen, listening to my own breathing mix with the eternal rustling of corn, and that's when I heard it. The distinct sound of a sliding door being tested, that soft bump when someone lifts it to see if it's locked. The dowel held, but whoever was out there kept trying, patient and methodical, lifting and releasing, like they had all the time in the world. The testing stopped after maybe 10 minutes, but I knew he hadn't left. Through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow passing between my car and the shed, too tall and upright to be an animal. My keys hung on the hook by the front door, 15 feet away, but reaching them meant crossing in front of the living room windows. The old farmhouse had too many windows, I realized. Windows I'd loved when I moved in because they let in so much natural light. Now each dark pane felt like an eye, like someone could be pressed against any of them, watching me stand frozen in my kitchen. I grabbed a knife from the block, the big one I used for chopping vegetables, and tried to think. The nearest neighbor, the Gibsons, lived 2 miles away. Even if I ran, even if I made it to the road, it would take 20 minutes to reach their house. 20 minutes in the dark with someone following through the corn, knowing every shortcut while I stumbled blind down the gravel road. A soft knock on the back door made me bite down on my own tongue to keep from screaming. Not pounding or aggressive, just 3 gentle taps, like a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar. Then his voice came through the wood, conversational and calm, with this odd sing-song quality that made my spine go rigid. "I know you're awake in there. I've been watching you for weeks now, learning your routines. You make chamomile tea before bed, read those mystery novels in your bedroom until your eyes get heavy. You sleep on your left side, facing the window. Did you know you talk in your sleep sometimes? Mostly about work stress. But last night you said a man's name, Christopher. Is that the ex-husband? He knew things no one could know unless they'd been inside my house, unless they'd stood next to my bed while I slept. The knife felt useless in my hand, a joke against someone who'd been close enough to hear me breathing in the dark, and I'd never even known. "The police won't come," he continued, his mouth so close to the door I could hear his lips brush the wood. "Your phone's dead, remember? And even if you got to your car, well, I took care of that earlier. Cut the fuel line while you were in the shower this evening. You use lavender shampoo, by the way. The smell carries through the bathroom vent." My legs started shaking so hard I had to lean against the counter to stay upright. This morning's shower, I'd felt safe, normal, washing my hair and planning my weekend. He'd been right outside, close enough to smell my shampoo, sabotaging my car while I stood naked and vulnerable behind a thin curtain. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, and I heard something metal scraping against the door frame. "You're going to let me in, and we're going to talk about why you've been so rude, ignoring me when I've put so much effort into getting to know you. Or I'm going to come in anyway and we'll have a very different conversation." The scraping sound meant he was working on the lock, and the old farmhouse doors weren't exactly high security. I had maybe 2 minutes before he got through. The front door was an option, but running into the dark meant running blind while he knew the property better than I did after weeks of surveillance. Hiding seemed pointless when he'd already proven he could get inside whenever he wanted. Then I remembered the crawl space access in the bedroom closet. The realtor had mentioned it during the tour, apologizing for the lack of a proper basement. It led under the house, coming out through a wooden panel near the front porch that looked decorative from the outside. If I could get into the crawl space before he broke through the back door, maybe I could slip out the front while he searched the house. I moved as quietly as I could toward the bedroom, avoiding the creaky board near the hallway that I'd learned about my first week here. Behind me, the scraping continued, mixed with his humming. Some tune I didn't recognize, cheerful and wrong in the darkness. The crawl space was exactly as horrible as I'd imagined. Maybe 3 feet high, dirt floor, thick with spider webs and the smell of rotting wood. I pulled the panel closed behind me and started crawling, trying not to think about what else might be down here with me. My knees sank into the soft earth, and something with too many legs skittered across my hand. Above me, I heard the back door finally give way, then heavy footsteps moving through my kitchen. "Where did you go?" His voice was louder now, annoyed rather than conversational. "This doesn't have to be difficult. I've been patient, haven't I? Weeks of watching, waiting for the right time to introduce myself properly." The footsteps moved toward the living room and I crawled faster, my fingers searching for the panel that should be somewhere ahead. The space narrowed as I went, forcing me to army crawl on my belly through dirt that tasted like decay when I accidentally breathed through my mouth. His footsteps stopped directly overhead, and I heard him opening closet doors, checking rooms, methodical in his search. My fingers finally found the wooden panel, and I pushed against it slowly, terrified it would creak. Cool night air hit my face as it opened, and I could see my front yard bathed in moonlight, the road just 50 yards away. I squeezed through the opening, dirt in my hair and eyes, and started running before I was even fully standing. Behind me, I heard him yell. Not words, just raw frustration when he realized I wasn't in the house. The gravel road tore at my bare feet, but I kept running, powered by adrenaline and terror. Halfway to the Gibsons' house, headlights appeared ahead, their teenage son Nathan coming home late from work. I practically threw myself in front of his truck, screaming for help, probably looking absolutely insane, covered in dirt and spiderwebs. But Nathan didn't hesitate. He pulled me into the truck, locked the doors, and drove straight to his parents' house, while calling 911 on his cell. When the real deputies arrived an hour later, not Brandon but older officers who took everything seriously, they found my back door broken, muddy footprints through my house, and that sleeping spot in the corn. But the man himself was gone, vanished into the miles of farmland and forest that surrounded the county. They never caught him. The investigation turned up DNA from the sleeping bag, fingerprints on my door frame, but nothing in any database. The detective assigned to my case a woman named Diane Russell, who'd worked stalking cases for 15 years, told me that wasn't unusual. "Some of these guys, they're ghosts until they escalate," she said, sitting across from me at the police station, while I gave my 5th statement. "You were smart to run. Smart to trust your instincts about those first signs." They found more evidence in the corn over the following days. Notebooks wrapped in plastic with detailed observations about my daily routines. Photographs taken through my windows with a telephoto lens. Even recordings of my phone conversations somehow captured from outside the house. The quantity suggested he'd been watching for months before I moved in. That maybe he'd been watching the property itself, waiting for someone like me, alone, isolated, vulnerable, to rent it. The owner had the corn cleared within a week, revealing 3 other makeshift camps at different vantage points around the property, each one positioned to watch a different side of the house. I stayed with the Gibsons for 2 weeks, while I arranged to break the lease and find somewhere new to live. A studio apartment in Columbus with a doorman and security cameras, neighbors close enough to hear if I screamed. The landlord tried to keep my security deposit, claiming I'd violated the lease terms, until Diane made a few phone calls and suddenly he was very accommodating, even refunding my last month's rent. Sometimes I Google the address of that farmhouse, checking if anyone new has rented it. So far, it stays empty. The listing photos showing my former bedroom with its big windows, the cleared field behind it looking naked and exposed without the corn. I still wake up some nights, convinced I can hear that patient lifting and releasing of a door, that cheerful humming in the darkness. My therapist says it's normal, that hypervigilance takes time to fade. But I notice things now, how many windows a place has, whether the doors are solid wood or hollow, if there are too many blind spots around a property. And I'll never again ignore those first small signs, those little violations that your mind wants to explain away. Because somewhere out there, he's probably doing it again, picking some other isolated farmhouse, some other woman living alone, starting with cigarette butts and footprints while he learns her routines, patient and methodical, waiting for the perfect night to finally introduce himself. The cornfield behind the Brennan property stretches for what feels like miles, and during late August of 2022, the stalks stood nearly 8 feet tall, creating these dense walls of green that whispered whenever the wind picked up. I'd driven out there with my girlfriend Jess and our friend group for what was supposed to be just another bonfire before everyone scattered for college again. The Brennans owned about 200 acres of farmland outside Cedar Rapids, and their daughter Allison had been hosting these gatherings since we were 16. That night, there were maybe 12 of us sitting around the fire pit they'd built about 50 yards from where the corn started, passing around cheap beer and talking about nothing important, while sparks drifted up toward the stars. Allison had just turned 19 the week before, and she kept joking about how this might be our last real summer together before adult life swallowed us whole. Around 11 that night, Allison's phone slipped out of her hoodie pocket when she stood up to grab another drink from the cooler, and we all heard it hit something hard before bouncing into the darkness toward the cornfield. She laughed and said she'd be right back, turned on her phone's flashlight using Jess's phone to call hers so it would light up, and walked toward the edge of the corn where we could hear it buzzing. The stalks swallowed her immediately, but we could track her movement by the glow of the flashlight filtering through the corn, and her voice calling out that she could see it, just a little further in. Her friend Kayla was recording some stupid video for Instagram and actually caught Allison disappearing between the rows, this casual moment that would later become evidence. We kept talking and laughing, waiting for her to come back, but after maybe 3 or 4 minutes, her boyfriend Noah called out asking if she needed help. And that's when we realized we couldn't see the flashlight anymore or hear her moving through the stalks. Noah stood up first, cupping his hands around his mouth and shouting her name into the darkness, and the rest of us quickly joined him at the edge of the cornfield, our voices overlapping as we called for Allison. The corn seemed to absorb our shouts, muffling them into nothing, and all we could hear was our own breathing and the constant rustling of leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. 5 of us formed a line and walked into the field together, arms outstretched so we wouldn't lose each other, moving slowly through the rows while calling her name every few seconds. The stalks were so thick that even with our phone flashlights, we could only see maybe 2 feet ahead, and the leaves kept slapping against our faces and arms, leaving these thin scratches that stung with sweat. After 20 minutes of searching, we found her phone lying face down in the dirt between 2 rows, the screen cracked but still glowing with Jess's missed calls. And that's when the real panic set in because Allison would never leave her phone behind, not even as a joke. We spent the next 3 hours searching that field, our voices getting hoarse from screaming her name, stumbling through the endless rows until our phones started dying one by one. Noah was practically hyperventilating, convinced she'd fallen and hit her head somewhere, while Kayla kept insisting we should have heard something, anything, if Allison had gotten hurt or lost, because sound carries weird in cornfields, but it doesn't just disappear entirely. By 2 in the morning, someone finally convinced Noah to call 911, and within an hour, the place was swarming with sheriff's deputies, volunteer firefighters, and search and rescue teams with powerful floodlights that lit up sections of the field like daylight. They brought in thermal imaging equipment, thinking maybe she'd passed out somewhere in the corn, and 2 different K9 units that both tracked her scent about 30 feet into the field before losing it completely, which the handlers said almost never happens unless someone gets into a vehicle. The Brennans came out in their bathrobes, Allison's mother Claire collapsing against her husband when she realized her daughter wasn't just playing some elaborate prank, and the sound she made was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, this raw wail that seemed to echo across the entire property. When the sun came up around 6 that morning, they had over 50 people walking shoulder to shoulder through the cornfield in a grid pattern, marking each row with orange tape as they cleared it. That's when one of the deputies found the footprints, a single set of bare feet in the soft dirt that started about 40 feet from where we'd found the phone, which made no sense because Allison had been wearing these beat-up Converse sneakers with smiley faces she'd drawn on them in Sharpie. The prints were small, definitely hers based on the size, and they followed this bizarre path through the corn, weaving between rows seemingly at random, before making a sharp turn toward the gravel road that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The detective taking photos kept muttering about how clean the impressions were. No drag marks or signs of struggle. Just deliberate steps from someone who had apparently stopped to take off their shoes in the middle of a cornfield at night for no logical reason. They followed those prints for nearly a quarter mile, past the point where anyone at the bonfire could have possibly heard her, all the way to where the corn ended and the road began. At the edge of the road, the footprint simply stopped, right there in the middle of nothing. No car tracks in the gravel, no signs of anyone else having been there. Just this abrupt end like she'd stepped off the earth entirely. The forensics team photographed every print, measured the stride length, took soil samples, even brought in some specialist from the state police who'd worked missing persons cases for 20 years, and he stood there staring at those last few footprints for almost an hour without saying anything. Later, when the detective interviewed us individually at the station, he kept asking these specific questions about whether Allison had seemed different lately, whether she'd mentioned meeting anyone online, whether she'd ever talked about wanting to disappear, and it was clear they thought she'd planned this somehow. But those of us who knew her understood that was impossible, because Allison had just gotten accepted into the nursing program at the University of Iowa, had already paid her deposit, had spent the whole night talking about her classes starting in 2 weeks, and she'd never, ever leave Noah without at least saying goodbye, not after they'd been together since sophomore year of high school. The thing that haunts me most happened 3 days after she disappeared, when the detective called us back to the station and showed us what they'd recovered from her phone. Most of it was normal stuff, texts about the bonfire, photos from earlier that night. But there was this recording that had started at 11:47 p.m., about 10 minutes after she'd walked into the corn, and it ran for nearly 2 hours before the battery died. The first few minutes were just rustling sounds and her breathing, normal enough, but then the breathing changed, became deeper and more rhythmic like she was walking with purpose, and you could hear her moving through the corn at a steady pace, never stumbling or stopping to look around. About 30 minutes in, there was this weird moment where the rustling stopped completely for maybe 10 seconds. Total silence except for her breathing, and then it resumed, but with this strange echo quality, like she was in a much larger space than just between corn rows. The detective played it for us on these high-end speakers, and we all heard it, this subtle shift in the acoustic quality that made no sense given where she was supposed to be. The really disturbing part came near the end of the recording, around the 90-minute mark, when you could hear what sounded like Allison humming this tune none of us recognized, just 5 or 6 notes repeated over and over. And her breathing had become so calm, it was almost like she was in some kind of trance. Then right before the phone died, there was this sound that made everyone in that room lean forward, a voice that was definitely Allison's but speaking in this flat, emotionless tone saying numbers. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22. Just random numbers with no pattern anyone could figure out. The FBI got involved at that point, running the audio through every kind of analysis, checking those numbers against everything from GPS coordinates to dates to code sequences, but they found nothing that made sense. Noah listened to that recording probably 100 times, convinced there was some message in it, some clue we were missing, until his parents finally made him stop because he wasn't sleeping anymore, just sitting in his room with headphones on, playing those numbers over and over. 2 weeks later, they found her shoes, both of them, placed neatly side by side on the shoulder of Highway 30, almost 15 miles from the Brennan property, sitting there like she'd just stepped out of them to walk barefoot down the asphalt. They were definitely hers, those Converse with the smiley faces, and they were clean. No mud or corn silk or anything that suggested they'd been in that field, which made no sense because we'd all seen her wearing them that night. The laces were still tied in her specific way, this double knot she always did because she hated when they came undone. And inside the left shoe was a receipt from a gas station none of us had ever heard of, time-stamped at 2:47 a.m. the night she disappeared, for a bottle of water and a pack of spearmint gum paid in cash. The detective drove out to that gas station, this little 24-hour place way out on some back road, and the night clerk remembered a girl matching Allison's description coming in around that time, but said she seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little quiet, and that she'd left on foot heading north even though he'd asked if she needed help finding something. What really messed with our heads was the security footage from that gas station, because it clearly showed Allison walking in at 2:46 a.m., barefoot and wearing the same clothes from the bonfire, moving with this strange, purposeful stride like she knew exactly where she was going. She bought the items, had a brief conversation with the clerk where she apparently told him she was going to see the Rose End, whatever that meant, and then walked out and turned north just like he'd said. The camera outside caught her walking along the edge of the road for about 30 seconds before she disappeared into the darkness, and that was the last confirmed sighting of her. The police searched every inch of ground between that gas station and where they'd found her shoes, brought in helicopters with infrared cameras, even drained a pond half a mile away, but found nothing else. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Allison had ever been anywhere near that stretch of highway. The investigation went on for months, with detectives following every possible lead, interviewing anyone who'd had contact with Allison in the weeks before she disappeared, checking traffic cameras from every intersection within a 50-mile radius, but they never found another trace of her. They discovered she'd been researching weird stuff online in the days before the bonfire, agricultural patterns, and something called liminality in rural spaces, which turned out to be some academic paper about psychological effects of repetitive landscapes like cornfields. But her browser history was otherwise normal, just college stuff and music videos. Her parents hired a private investigator who spent 6 months retracing every step, even brought in some expert on missing persons who'd worked cases all over the Midwest. But he just confirmed what we already knew. People don't just vanish like this, walking barefoot out of a cornfield in the middle of the night with no explanation, no motive, no destination that anyone could identify. The hardest part was watching the Brennans slowly accept that their daughter might never come home, seeing them take down the missing person flyers as they weathered and faded, watching Noah transfer to a different school because he couldn't handle being in Cedar Rapids anymore. The cornfield is still there, though the Brennans don't plant it anymore, just let it go wild with prairie grass and weeds that grow taller each summer until you can barely tell it was ever cultivated land. Sometimes I drive past on my way to visit Jess's parents, and I always slow down at that spot where the field meets the road, wondering if maybe I'll see something everyone else missed, some clue that explains where Allison went that night. The gas station clerk quit his job a few months after she disappeared. Said he kept having dreams about a girl walking north into the darkness, and the new clerk doesn't know anything about it, just shrugs when people ask about the girl who came through that night talking about Rose Ending. Noah sent me a message last month. First time I'd heard from him in over a year, just a simple question. Do you ever hear those numbers in your head? And I knew exactly what he meant because sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear Allison's flat voice reciting them. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22, like she's still out there somewhere, walking barefoot through endless rows of corn, following some path only she can see. Jamie always came home at 3:45, give or take 2 minutes. I'd been timing him since the start of the school year, mostly out of boredom while I waited for my shift at the hardware store to start at 5. My younger brother was 14 and predictable as clockwork. You could set your watch by the sound of him kicking off his sneakers on the back porch. October had settled over our part of Illinois with unusual cold that year, and the acres of corn behind our house had turned that particular shade of brown that meant harvest was overdue. That Wednesday, I stood at the kitchen window eating a sandwich, watching the clock tick past 4, then 4:30, and Jamie never showed. Mom was still at the dentist's office where she worked reception, and Dad wouldn't be back from the plant until after 7. By 5:15, I'd already called the school twice, walked the road to check for accidents, and finally forced myself to face what I'd been avoiding, checking the shortcut through the corn that Jamie had been using since 6th grade. My brother treated that field like his personal highway, cutting 20 minutes off his walk home every single day. He knew every deer trail, every irrigation pipe, every spot where the rows opened into small clearings. I found his entry point immediately, the same gap near the rusted fence post where he always ducked in, his handprints visible in the orange rust from years of grabbing it for balance. His footprints were fresh in the soft dirt, those beat-up Converse with the loose heel leaving their familiar marks. I followed them for about 30 yards before backing out and calling 911, trying to keep my voice steady while explaining that my brother hadn't come home. Within an hour, we had 3 sheriff's deputies tramping through our kitchen, tracking mud everywhere while Deputy Coleman explained his theory about spatial disorientation in tall crops. He said it like he was reading from a manual, like Jamie hadn't spent 4 years learning every landmark in those 200 acres, like my brother was some city kid who'd never seen corn before. They searched until midnight that first night, brought in dogs the next morning, even used a drone with thermal imaging on Friday. Nothing. The dogs tracked Jamie's scent for maybe 300 yards into the field before losing it completely, like he'd just vanished into thin air. The handler, a woman named Cheryl with deep wrinkles around her eyes, kept making her German Shepherd go back to the same spot, clearly frustrated that the trail just stopped. She asked me 3 times if there were any old wells or storm cellars in the field, and each time I told her no, just corn and dirt and more corn. The thermal drone picked up plenty of deer, a few coyotes, but no heat signature that could be Jamie. Sheriff Garrett held a press conference on Saturday talking about ongoing search efforts, while basically telling everyone that kids sometimes run away, that the corn made it hard to find anyone, that we needed to consider all possibilities. Mom stopped sleeping after that, just sat at the kitchen table staring at Jamie's school photo, while Dad drove around checking abandoned barns and talking to farmers within a 10-mile radius. By Monday, a week after Jamie disappeared, the official search was scaled back to routine patrols. I couldn't stand the waiting anymore, couldn't stand how everyone was starting to talk about my brother in past tense. That morning after my parents left, Mom to put up more flyers, Dad to check the bus station in Peoria again, I went back to the field alone. The cops had trampled the original trail, but I knew Jamie's patterns well enough to guess his likely route. He always veered left after entering the field, following a slight ridge that kept his feet drier when the ground was muddy. I pushed through the corn, ignoring how the dry leaves cut at my arms, counting my paces like Jamie had taught me when we were kids playing hide and seek. At around 400 yards in, well past where the dogs had lost his scent, I found something the searchers had missed, a partial footprint, just the toe of his Converse preserved under a fallen cornstalk. The angle was wrong though, like he'd been walking backwards or spinning around, and the dirt around it had strange marks, almost like something had been dragged, but not quite. I kept following the disturbed earth, crawling on my knees now to see under the bent stalks, and that's when I spotted it. Jamie's backpack sitting perfectly upright against a cornstalk like someone had carefully placed it there. Not thrown, not dropped, but set down deliberately with the zippers all closed and the straps adjusted evenly. My brother was messy, always tossing his stuff around, never zipped anything properly in his life. The backpack was clean too, no dirt or moisture on it despite sitting there for a week. Inside, everything was arranged wrong. His textbooks stacked by size, his pencils all facing the same direction in their case, his half-eaten bag of chips folded closed and paper-clipped. Jamie didn't even own paper clips. About 10 feet away, positioned exactly parallel to the cornrows, I found his left shoe. Just one shoe, laces still tied in Jamie's weird double-knot style, but the shoe itself was pristine, like someone had wiped it clean before placing it there. The sock was tucked inside, folded into a perfect little square. The trail of disturbed soil continued for another 20 yards past the shoe, and I followed it, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the wind rattling the corn. The marks in the dirt were deliberate, not random drag patterns, but almost like symbols or letters, though I couldn't make sense of them. They led to a small clearing where several corn stalks had been bent down in a rough circle, their tops woven together overhead to form a kind of shelter or blind. Inside this space, the ground was completely smooth, swept clean of any debris or footprints. In the exact center, someone had dug a shallow depression, maybe 6 inches deep and perfectly round. The extracted dirt formed into a neat ring around it. At the bottom of the depression lay Jamie's student ID card, his house key, and 3 pennies from his pocket, arranged in a triangle. The plastic ID wasn't scratched or dirty. It looked like someone had polished it. But what made me stumble backward was what I saw pressed into the smooth dirt around these items. Dozens of footprints, all from the same shoe, all exactly the same depth, forming a spiral pattern that wound inward to the center. They were Jamie's prints from his right shoe, the one still on his foot. I ran back to the house, crashing through the corn rows without caring about the cuts on my arms, and called Sheriff Garrett directly. This time I had evidence, something concrete they couldn't dismiss as teenage runaway behavior. Garrett himself came out with 2 detectives from the state police, and I led them to the clearing, my legs shaking the whole way. They took photos of everything, bagged the items, made casts of the footprints, but I could see the confusion on their faces. Detective Mills kept asking if I was sure I hadn't touched anything, if maybe Jamie had made this himself as some kind of prank or cry for attention. I wanted to scream at him that Jamie wasn't that kind of kid, that someone had taken my brother and arranged his things like trophies. They brought in a forensics team that afternoon, and that's when things got even stranger. The footprint spiral showed Jamie had walked it at least 30 times, based on the depth and overlap, but there were no other prints anywhere, not even partials. Whoever had been with him had either never touched the ground or had carefully erased their tracks while leaving Jamie's intact. The forensics tech, a young guy named Bradley who looked fresh from college, pulled me aside while the others were documenting the scene. He showed me something on his tablet, enhanced photos of the dirt marks I'd thought might be symbols. Under magnification, they weren't random at all. They were measurements, precise distances marked in the soil, all pointing to different spots in the field. Bradley had mapped them, and they formed a grid pattern extending out from the clearing in perfectly straight lines, each endpoint exactly 150 feet from the center. He asked if Jamie was good at math, if he might have been interested in surveying or geometry. I told him Jamie could barely pass algebra, that he couldn't measure anything without messing it up. Bradley just nodded and went back to the others, but I saw him taking more photos, making notes in a separate notebook he didn't share with the detectives. Before they left, he slipped me a piece of paper with his number, told me to call if I found anything else, anything at all that seemed arranged or measured. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the grid pattern Bradley had shown me. After my parents went to bed, Mom finally knocked out by sleeping pills, Dad passed out on the couch still wearing his work boots. I grabbed a compass and measuring tape from the garage and went back to the field. The moon was nearly full, giving just enough light to navigate between the corn rows without a flashlight that might alert the neighbors. I found the clearing again and started checking Bradley's measurements, following the grid lines out to their endpoints. At the first marker, exactly 150 feet north of the clearing, I found another small depression in the ground, this one containing Jamie's calculator watch, the band cut cleanly in half. The second point to the east had his gym whistle on its lanyard, tied in a complex knot I'd never seen before. Each endpoint had something of Jamie's, all items he would have had with him that day, all placed with the same obsessive precision. The western point made me stop breathing for a full 10 seconds. There, arranged in a perfect line, were Jamie's baby teeth, the ones Mom had saved in a little box in her jewelry drawer. All 12 of them, spaced exactly 1 inch apart, pressed into the soil so only their tops were visible. How could anyone have known about those teeth? How could they have gotten into our house, into Mom's room, without us noticing? I started digging frantically around the teeth, my fingers clawing at the dirt, and about 6 inches down, I hit something solid. It was Jamie's phone, wrapped in clear plastic, the screen still showing his last text to me from that Wednesday. Home in 20, save me some pizza. The battery was dead, but the phone was perfectly clean inside its wrapping, like someone had sealed it away for safekeeping. Underneath the phone, pressed into the clay, was a single adult footprint, not a shoe print, but a bare foot, with unusually long toes, and what looked like a 6th toe's impression on the left side. The print was deep, deeper than my own when I stood next to it, suggesting someone much heavier despite the narrow shape of the foot. I called Bradley from the field, whispering into my phone while crouched in the corn. He answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting for my call. And when I told him about the baby teeth and the footprint, he went silent for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then he told me to take photos of everything but not to call the sheriff yet. He said he'd been doing some research, checking through old missing persons cases in the area, and he'd found something. 3 other kids had vanished in cornfields over the past 15 years, all within a 50-mile radius, all in October, all between the ages of 12 and 15. The cases had never been connected because they happened in different counties, different jurisdictions, but the pattern was there. Each time the official search found nothing, dogs lost the trail, and the kids were written off as runaways. Bradley had driven out to one of the old sites that afternoon, a field near Effingham that had since been developed into a subdivision. The construction crew had found strange things when they cleared the land. Items arranged in geometric patterns, footprints that didn't match any of the workers, and according to one foreman Bradley had tracked down, a complex tunnel system that didn't appear on any survey maps. The southern grid point was the last one I checked, and I almost wished I hadn't. There, in a shallow hole covered with carefully arranged corn husks, was a stack of photographs. They were all of Jamie, taken over the course of months, maybe years. Jamie walking to school, Jamie in our backyard, Jamie through his bedroom window. Some were so recent I recognized the clothes, the shirt he'd worn the previous week, the jacket he'd gotten for his birthday in September. But others were older, showing Jamie at 12, at 10, even one that looked like it was taken when he was maybe 7 or 8, at a school field day I barely remembered. Whoever had taken these had been watching my brother for half his life, had been in our neighborhood, near our house, close enough to photograph him through windows. At the bottom of the stack was a hand-drawn map of our property and the cornfield, marked with dates and times, noting Jamie's routes and routines with terrifying accuracy. The final notation, written in small, precise handwriting, was for that Wednesday, 3:15 p.m., intercept at position 7. Position 7 was marked deep in the field, right around where the dogs had lost Jamie's scent. Bradley arrived at the field 40 minutes later with ground-penetrating radar equipment he'd borrowed from the university. We worked in silence, scanning the area around position 7. And just before dawn, the equipment detected an anomaly, a void about 8 feet underground, extending horizontally for at least 20 feet before the signal degraded. Bradley called in favors, got a full FBI team out there by noon, told them about the pattern of disappearances, the photographs, everything. They brought in excavation equipment, and by evening they'd broken through into a narrow tunnel, hand-dug and reinforced with scavenged materials, leading to a series of small chambers carved from the clay. The smell that came up from that hole, earth and something else, something organic and wrong, made everyone step back. The FBI sent in a robot with a camera first, and when they saw what was down there, They cleared everyone out except essential personnel. They found Jamie alive in the third chamber, semi-conscious and dehydrated but breathing, along with 2 other kids, a girl from Champaign who'd gone missing 3 weeks earlier, and a boy from Decatur whose parents had reported him as a runaway 6 days ago. The man they arrested lived alone in a farmhouse 4 miles away, had worked as a surveyor for the county 20 years ago, before an injury left him on disability. Harold Jenks, 63 years old, 6'4", with a birth defect that gave him an extra toe on his left foot. He'd been using the tunnel system for over a decade, expanding it each year, accessing it through hidden entrances in 3 different cornfields. The FBI found journals in his house, thousands of pages documenting his observations of children, his selection process, his careful planning. He wrote about keeping them underground during the harvest season, when the noise of machinery would mask any sounds, then moving them through the tunnels to different locations, always staying ahead of the searches. Jamie doesn't remember much. Jenks had drugged him with something that affected his memory, made him compliant enough to walk that spiral pattern over and over, while Jenks watched from a blind he'd built in the corn. The other kids had similar gaps in their memories, just fragments of darkness and the sound of corn rustling overhead. Jenks pleaded guilty to avoid trial, got life without parole, and never explained why he did it beyond saying the fields told him to. Jamie came home after a week in the hospital, physically okay but different, quieter. He hasn't walked through a cornfield since, takes the long way to school now, stays on the sidewalks and paved roads. The field behind our house was harvested that November, and Dad convinced the owner to plant soybeans the next year, then wheat, anything but corn. We never talk about it, but sometimes I catch Jamie staring out his bedroom window at where the cornfield used to be, and I wonder what he's remembering, what fragments of those dark hours underground still surface in his dreams. The fence posts stretched for miles across that Nebraska property, each one needing new wire, or a complete replacement after the spring storms had torn through. I'd been picking up mechanic work at a shop in Omaha for about 6 months, when Jerry, one of the regulars, mentioned his uncle needed someone handy for a week-long job out in the country. The pay was double what I was making, cash up front, plus room and board at the farmhouse. My beat-up Chevy truck needed new tires and the rent was overdue, so I loaded my tools that Sunday morning and drove 3 hours west into nowhere. The land out there was different than anything I'd seen growing up near Denver, just endless fields of corn already standing 7 feet tall in early July, broken only by gravel roads that seemed to lead nowhere special. Walter Hoffman turned out to be somewhere past 70, with fingers bent from arthritis, and a way of squinting at you like he was trying to read fine print. His farmhouse sat alone on 800 acres, the nearest neighbor a good 4 miles down the county road. He showed me to a small room above the garage, just a mattress and a dresser that smelled like motor oil, then walked me along the fence line that needed fixing. The corn grew right up to the posts in most places, leaving these narrow corridors where I'd have to work, barely wide enough to swing a hammer. Walter said he'd planted late this year because of the rain, and the stalks were growing fast in the heat, already thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows. He'd leave me alone during the day, he explained, since his hip made walking hard, but dinner would be ready at 6 sharp in the main house. The first 3 days went smooth enough, just me and the fence posts under that Nebraska sun, sweat dripping while I hammered new boards and stretched wire until my arms burned. The only sounds were the meadowlarks calling from somewhere beyond the corn and this constant rustling the wind made pushing through all those leaves. Sometimes I'd catch myself stopping work just to listen to it, that ocean sound of thousands of stalks swaying together, almost hypnotic if you let it get to you. Around Wednesday afternoon, I was working a section near the back of the property when I heard something else mixed in with that rustling. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, moving through the rows about 20 yards from where I was kneeling with my pliers. I stood up and called out, thinking maybe Walter had walked out to check on my progress, but the footsteps stopped immediately, leaving just that endless whisper of corn moving in the breeze. That night at dinner, I asked Walter if anyone else ever came through the property. Maybe hunters or kids from town looking for trouble. He stopped cutting his pork chop and gave me that squinting look again, like I'd asked something peculiar. Nobody had any business being on his land, he said, and nobody from town would drive all the way out here just to walk through corn. The way he said it made me feel stupid for asking, so I dropped it and focused on my plate. But when I was walking back to my room above the garage, I noticed how complete the darkness was out there. No streetlights, no house lights except Walter's windows, just stars and the massive shadow of the cornfield surrounding everything. My truck sat parked by the garage, and on impulse I tried starting it just to hear the engine. But when I turned the key, nothing happened except a clicking sound from under the hood. The battery was dead, completely drained even though I'd just driven it 3 days ago without any problems. I popped the hood with my phone flashlight since the garage had no overhead light, and everything looked normal. No loose cables, no corrosion on the terminals. I figured I'd ask Walter for a jump in the morning, but when I checked my phone to set an alarm, the screen showed no signal bars at all. Not even one. I'd had at least 2 bars the first day, enough to text my roommate that I'd arrived safely. Now the phone was basically a brick, useless except as a flashlight. Standing there between my dead truck and that wall of corn just 30 feet away, I felt this weight settle in my chest, like when you realize you've made a mistake but can't quite name what it is yet. The corn rustled louder in the night breeze, and I swear I heard those same measured footsteps again, closer this time, maybe just inside the first row of stalks. Friday morning came with fog so thick I couldn't see the cornfield from my window. Just white mist pressed against the glass like cotton. I found Walter in his kitchen already drinking coffee, and when I mentioned my truck trouble, he said his battery charger had broken last month, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. The nearest auto parts store was in town, 40 minutes away, and he couldn't drive me there until Monday, when he did his supply run. 3 more days stuck here. I asked about using his landline to call someone, maybe Jerry back in Omaha, but Walter said the phone lines went down in the last storm, and the phone company hadn't come out yet. His words made sense, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, like he'd been expecting these exact questions. I spent that day working the fence, but now every sound from the corn made me stop and stare into those green walls, trying to see between the stalks. That Friday night changed everything. I was lying on the mattress above the garage, windows open because the heat was suffocating when I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't staying in the corn. They were moving along the fence line I'd been repairing, slow and deliberate, occasionally stopping right where I'd been working hours before. I crept to the window and looked down, but the darkness was absolute beyond the small circle of light from Walter's porch bulb. Then I heard the fence wire snap, that distinct metallic twang of tension releasing, followed by another snap, then another. Someone was cutting through my work, destroying what I'd spent days fixing. I grabbed my phone for light and rushed downstairs, but by the time I reached the fence, the footsteps had retreated back into the corn. 3 sections of new wire hung loose, cleanly cut with what must have been wire cutters. The cuts were precise, deliberate, not random vandalism, but something purposeful. Walter barely looked up from his eggs when I told him Saturday morning about the cut fence. Kids from town, he said, probably the same ones who'd been stealing gas from farms all summer. But his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee mug, and I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows that faced the cornfield. I spent the morning repairing the damaged sections, jumping at every rustle, every bird call. Around noon, I decided to walk the perimeter of the property, looking for tire tracks or footprints, anything that might explain who was doing this. The corn rows ran along 3 sides of Walter's land, with only the front facing the county road clear. As I walked along the eastern edge, where the stalks grew thickest, I found something that made me stop cold. A narrow path cut into the corn, barely visible unless you were looking straight at it. The stalks had been carefully pushed aside, not broken, creating a tunnel that disappeared into the green darkness. Fresh boot prints marked the entrance, the treads still sharp in the dry soil. I stood at that entrance for a long time, listening to the corn move around me, trying to convince myself to follow that path and see where it led. But something primal in my gut screamed against it. Whoever made that trail knew these fields, had probably been using them for weeks or months, maybe longer. They could be waiting in there just far enough and where the light barely reached, watching the entrance. Instead, I backed away and continued my circuit around the property, finding 2 more hidden paths cut into different sections of the field. All of them angled toward the house and garage, like spokes on a wheel with Walter's buildings at the center. That afternoon, I confronted Walter directly, told him about the paths, said someone was definitely living or hiding in his corn. His face went pale, almost gray, and he gripped the kitchen table hard enough that his knuckles went white. Then he told me something that made everything worse. The corn wasn't his. He'd leased those fields to a company 5 years ago, some agricultural outfit from Kansas City, and they planted and harvested without his involvement. He had no idea who worked those fields or when they came through. Saturday night, I barricaded myself in the room above the garage, pushing the dresser against the door and keeping a hammer within reach. Sleep was impossible. Every sound became footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like breathing. Around midnight, I heard voices, low, muffled, but definitely human, coming from somewhere near the garage. I pressed my ear to the floor and could make out at least 2 different speakers, maybe 3, but couldn't understand the words. They were directly below me in the garage with my dead truck. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then footsteps scattered in different directions, some heading back toward the corn, others moving toward the main house where Walter slept. I watched from my window as a shadow passed through the porch light's glow, tall, wearing what looked like coveralls, carrying something long in one hand. The figure stopped at Walter's front door, stood there for a full minute, then walked back toward the cornfield, disappearing into one of those hidden paths. Sunday morning, Walter wasn't in the kitchen at his usual time. I found him sitting on his porch, staring at the cornfield with hollow eyes, looking like he hadn't slept at all. When I sat down beside him, he started talking without prompting, his voice barely above a whisper. The company that leased his fields, he said. They'd stopped sending checks 2 years ago, stopped answering his calls, but people still came to work the corn. Different people each season, arriving in unmarked vans, never talking to him, never asking permission. He'd tried calling the police once, but the sheriff said without proof of trespassing or crime, there was nothing to investigate. The workers had keys to the equipment shed behind the corn, legal access roads through neighboring properties. Walter suspected they were growing more than corn in those fields, using the dense rows to hide other activities, maybe drugs, maybe worse. He'd been too scared to look closer, too old to fight back, so he just stayed in his house and pretended not to notice when they came through at night. I told Walter we were leaving immediately, both of us that morning. We could walk to the county road and flag down a car if we had to. But he shook his head, said they'd never let us leave on foot, not in daylight when they could see us from the corn. Our only chance was his truck Monday morning, acting like nothing was wrong, like it was just his regular supply run. Until then, we had to play along, pretend we didn't know anything. That Sunday crawled by in suffocating tension, both of us going through the motions, me pretending to work on the fence, Walter puttering around his yard, both of us avoiding looking at the corn even as we felt eyes watching from within. As darkness fell, Walter handed me his truck keys and an old revolver he'd kept hidden. Only 3 bullets left in the cylinder. He told me to be ready at dawn, to get to his truck fast when he gave the signal. We'd make a run for town and never come back. That night they came for my truck. I watched from my window as 4 figures emerged from different paths in the corn, converging on the garage below. They worked in complete silence, no talking, just efficient movement as they pushed my truck out of the garage and down toward the cornfield. They were taking it somewhere into those rows, probably to strip it for parts or hide it where no one would ever find it. One of them looked up at my window before they disappeared, just stood there staring at where I was hiding behind the curtain, making sure I knew they knew exactly where I was. I gripped Walter's revolver tighter and waited for them to come upstairs, but after a few minutes the figure turned and followed the others into the corn. The message was clear. We were allowed to leave in the morning, but only because they decided to let us go. They owned this place now, not Walter, and everyone involved understood the terms. Monday came with a blood-red sunrise that painted the corn stalks orange. Walter was already in his truck when I sprinted from the garage, expecting someone to emerge from the fields at any moment. But nothing moved except the corn swaying in the morning breeze. We drove down that gravel drive faster than was safe, dust clouding behind us, neither of us speaking until we hit the paved county road. Walter drove straight to the state police station in Grand Island, told them everything while I sat there still clutching his revolver in my jacket pocket. The cops sent units out that afternoon, but they found nothing. No paths in the corn, no footprints, no sign of my truck. Even the cut fence wires had been replaced with new ones. The detective said without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Walter sold the farm 2 months later to some development company from out of state, took whatever they offered and moved to Arizona to live with his daughter. I never got my truck back, never got paid for the fence work either. Sometimes I search online for news about that area of Nebraska, looking for stories about drug busts or missing persons found in cornfields, but there's never anything. Whatever they were doing out there in those endless rows, they're probably still doing it now, using some other old farmer's land, watching from the corn. October brings out the worst in people, and after working at Frightland Farms for 6 weeks, I thought I'd seen it all. College was draining my bank account faster than my parents predicted, so when I saw the Help Wanted sign for the corn maze back in September, $30 an hour seemed too good to pass up. The maze sprawled across 12 acres of farmland just outside Bakersfield, with walls of corn stalks reaching 8 feet high, and paths that twisted into dead ends designed to make visitors panic. My job was simple enough. Reset the motion-activated props between tours, guide lost families to the exit, and make sure nobody vandalized the animatronic scarecrows. That particular Saturday night, we'd run 7 tours back-to-back, each one packed with screaming teenagers and drunk adults who thought jumping out at other guests was hilarious. By the time we locked the main gate at midnight, my ears were ringing from all the chainsaw sound effects, and dried corn silk had worked its way into every piece of clothing I wore. The parking lot emptied out quickly after closing, leaving just 3 cars: mine, the manager Keith's pickup truck, and a sedan that belonged to Vicky from concessions. Keith had asked me and 2 other guys to stay late for breakdown duty, promising an extra $50 cash if we helped haul the expensive decorations into storage before the rain forecasted for Sunday morning. Most of the electronic stuff needed to come down first: the strobe lights, fog machines, and those motion sensors that triggered recorded screams whenever someone walked past. The other guys started at the entrance while I headed toward the back sections with a wheelbarrow and my phone flashlight, since the overhead lights would shut off automatically at 12:30 to save electricity. The corn rustled in the wind, creating whispers that made me jumpy even though I knew every inch of these paths. I'd just disconnected the zombie mannequin at checkpoint 4 when the first section of lights went dark, way earlier than scheduled. Then the second section cut out, and the third like someone was flipping breakers in sequence, leaving me stranded in complete darkness, with nothing but my phone's weak beam cutting through the shadows. "Keith," I called out, expecting to hear his gravelly voice boom back from the entrance, but nothing came except the sound of corn stalks brushing against each other. The generator should have kicked in by now. We had backup power specifically for situations like this, installed after some kids got lost in the dark 2 years ago, and their parents threatened to sue. I tried calling Keith's cell, but the screen showed no signal, which wasn't unusual since reception was spotty out here, but the timing made my chest tight. That's when I heard it, a voice answering from somewhere deep in the maze, muffled by the walls of corn but definitely human. "Yeah, coming," it said, but something was wrong with the tone, Too high-pitched to be Keith, too cheerful for anyone who'd just worked a 12-hour shift. The voice had that fake quality actors use when they're trying too hard to sound casual, like someone reading lines for the first time. I aimed my phone toward where the sound came from, but the light barely penetrated 5 feet before the darkness swallowed it whole. My first instinct was to head back toward the entrance, but the path behind me looked identical to the one ahead, just walls of corn pressing in from both sides. We'd designed the maze to disorient people during daylight hours, and now, in pitch darkness with my phone battery at 30%, every turn looked the same. Another sound cut through the rustling, and this time it was definitely laughter. Not from the speakers we'd installed at corner posts, but from somewhere between the rows, like someone was standing just behind the corn wall next to me. The laugh had that unhinged quality drunk people get when they think they're being funny, but they're really just being creepy, drawn out, and ending in a wheeze. "Real hilarious, guys," I shouted, figuring it was probably Brett and Miguel trying to mess with me, but my voice cracked halfway through. The laughter stopped immediately, replaced by footsteps, not on the packed dirt paths but pushing through the corn itself, snapping stalks as whoever it was forced their way through the walls instead of using the maze routes. The wheelbarrow I'd been pushing sat abandoned behind me somewhere, and I couldn't remember which checkpoint I'd passed last. Every horror movie I'd ever watched screamed at me not to investigate, to just run, but running blind through a maze designed to trap people seemed equally stupid. My phone flashlight started flickering, not dying completely but stuttering like a strobe light, which made the shadows between the corn rows jump and dance. During one of the dark moments, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving parallel to me through the stalks, keeping pace but never quite showing itself fully. The smell hit me then, not the earthy scent of corn and soil I'd gotten used to, but something chemical and wrong, like rubber burning mixed with that sickly sweet stench of spilled energy drinks. Whoever this was had been here a while, maybe since before we opened for the evening tours, waiting in some corner we never checked. The thought made bile rise in my throat because we'd had hundreds of people walk through here tonight, including families with little kids, and this person had been watching the whole time. I forced myself to think logically about the maze layout. The exit was always northeast from any point. That's how we'd mapped it for emergency situations. But without the overhead lights or the glowing arrows we put up for the younger kids' tours, northeast meant nothing. The footsteps had stopped, which somehow felt worse than hearing them because now I had no idea where the person was. Then my phone started ringing, the sound impossibly loud in the silence, Keith's name lighting up the screen. Relief flooded through me as I answered, but the voice that came through wasn't Keith's. "Having fun yet?" the same high-pitched voice from earlier asked, and I realized with cold certainty that whoever was in here with me had Keith's phone. The line went dead before I could respond, and when I looked at my screen, my battery had dropped to 20%, even though it had been at 30 just minutes ago. The corn to my left suddenly parted, stalks bending outward like something large was pushing through, and I saw fingers, too long with dirt caked under the nails, reaching through the gap toward where I stood. I stumbled backward and ran, not caring anymore about finding the exit, just needing to put distance between me and those reaching fingers. The maze paths forked and twisted, and I took turns at random, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the corn walls. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not running but walking steadily, calmly, like whoever it was knew exactly where I would end up. They started whistling, the tune familiar but wrong, like a children's song played in a minor key. My phone light caught a reflection ahead, metal gleaming in the darkness, and I recognized one of our emergency exit signs, the ones we installed after the lawsuit threat. The gate was padlocked, of course, but the fence was only 6 feet high, chain link that I could climb if I could just reach it. 20 more yards, 15, 10, and then something wrapped around my ankle, sending me sprawling face first into the dirt path. When I rolled over, gasping and spitting out soil, I saw what had tripped me. A foam machete from one of our props, but attached to it was a note written in what looked like brown marker. "You walked past me 17 times tonight." The whistling had stopped, and in the sudden quiet, I heard something that made my situation infinitely worse. Multiple voices, at least 3, maybe 4, all whispering in unison from different parts of the maze. They were coordinating, I realized, using the paths to herd me towards something. My phone finally died, plunging me into absolute darkness just as I heard the chain link fence rattle somewhere to my right. They were climbing it, blocking my escape route. The whispering grew louder and I could make out words now. Section 3 clear. He's moving toward checkpoint 7. Block the maintenance gate. These weren't random creeps who'd hidden after hours. They'd studied our maze, learned our procedures, maybe even taken one of our employee maps from the break room. The smell was stronger now, and I realized why it seemed familiar. It was the same combination of smells from the storage unit where we kept the old decorations, the ones from 5 years ago when an employee named Curtis had disappeared during breakdown and never been found. We joked about it sometimes, called it the Curtis curse, but right now, crouched in the dirt with strangers surrounding me, I wondered if maybe Curtis hadn't disappeared at all. The ground beneath me vibrated slightly, and I heard the unmistakable sound of our industrial wood chipper starting up somewhere near the maintenance shed. We used it to mulch the corn stalks after the season ended, but hearing it now, in the dark with these people hunting me, sent ice through my veins. They weren't just trying to scare me. They had access to our equipment, knew where we kept the keys. A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness about 50 feet away, sweeping back and forth methodically. And in its glow, I saw a figure wearing one of our employee uniforms from years ago. The old green ones we'd replaced with red ones 3 seasons back. The person holding the light was tall, skeletal thin, with hair that hung in greasy strands over their face. When they turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of their smile, too wide, showing too many teeth like they'd been practicing it in a mirror but couldn't quite get it right. "Found you," they sang out in that high-pitched voice, and 2 more flashlights clicked on from different directions, forming a triangle with me at the center. Something inside me snapped then, not breaking but hardening into pure survival instinct. I grabbed handful after handful of dirt and started throwing it at the nearest flashlight, then dove through the corn wall to my left, not caring about the stalks cutting my face and arms. The corn rows weren't planted in perfect lines. There were gaps if you knew where to look, spaces where the irrigation system created natural corridors. I'd spent 6 weeks learning every inch of this place, and now that knowledge was the only thing keeping me alive. Behind me, I heard them crashing through the corn, no longer coordinated, angry now. The wood chipper's sound grew louder as I headed toward it, which seemed insane, but I remembered something. The maintenance shed had a landline, an old phone that connected directly to the security company. If I could get there first, if I could lock myself in and make that call, maybe I'd survive this. The shed appeared in the darkness, a darker shadow against the night sky, and I could see the door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. The smart thing would be to avoid it, to know it was a trap, but I could hear them getting closer, and the sound of the wood chipper meant someone was already there, waiting. I burst through the shed door and immediately saw Keith, tied to a chair with orange extension cords, duct tape over his mouth, his eyes wide with terror, but alive. The wood chipper sat in the corner, running empty, just making noise to lure me here. Before I could move toward Keith, the door slammed shut behind me, and the skeletal figure stepped out from behind a stack of fertilizer bags. Up close, I could see their face clearly. Hollow cheeks, eyes that didn't blink enough, and that horrible smile that looked carved into their face. "You lasted longer than Curtis," they said in that sing-song voice, pulling something from their pocket that gleamed silver in the dim light from the emergency exit sign. It was a set of keys, car keys, house keys, and smaller keys I recognized as the ones from our employee lockers. Dozens of sets, all on different rings, some rusty, some new, and I understood with sickening clarity that Curtis wasn't there first, and I wouldn't be there last. They took a step toward me, and I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a canister of pesticide spray we used for wasp nests. The label warned about eye contact, about permanent damage, about keeping away from open flames, and I remembered the lighter in my pocket from my smoke break 6 hours ago, back when my biggest worry was a statistics midterm. What happened next took maybe 10 seconds, but I can still see every detail when I close my eyes. I sprayed the pesticide directly at their face while flicking the lighter with my other hand, creating a makeshift flamethrower that sent them stumbling backward, screaming in a voice that finally sounded human. The others burst through the door just as the pesticide canister emptied, and in the chaos, I managed to cut Keith free with a box cutter from the workbench. We ran toward his truck while they tried to help their leader, whose face was a mess of chemical burns and singed hair. Keith's hands shook so badly I had to dig the keys from his pocket myself, and we peeled out of there, gravel spraying, while 3 figures stood in the parking lot watching us go. The police found evidence of at least 12 different people who'd gone missing from corn mazes across 3 states over the past 8 years, all during the Halloween season. They arrested 4 people living in an abandoned farmhouse 2 miles from Frightland Farms, and during the trial, we learned they'd been employees at various mazes over the years, learning layouts, studying procedures, choosing victims who stayed late. The wood chipper had been cleaned with bleach so many times the metal was pitted, but forensics still found traces. I finished college, got my degree, moved to Portland where there's no farmland for miles, but every October when the leaves change and people start decorating for Halloween, I smell that mixture of burnt rubber and energy drinks, and I remember those fingers reaching through the corn. The Corn Maze Festival had always been the highlight of autumn in our town. Families came from neighboring counties to eat fried dough, take hay rides, and get lost among the tall golden rows that stretched beyond the church steeple. I helped with parking that year, waving cars toward the muddy field behind the grain silo. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend. Warm cider, local bands, kids running with flashlights through the stalks. No one imagined that before the night was over, a 17-year-old named Tyler Green would vanish without a trace. I remember hearing his name for the first time over the loudspeaker. The announcer's voice cracked halfway through, like he did not quite believe what he was saying. People laughed at first, thinking it was a prank. Tyler had entered the maze around 6 in the evening with 3 friends, and by dusk, he had separated from them. They assumed he went out another exit, but when the fireworks started at 9, his parents realized he was not anywhere near the crowd. That is when the panic began to spread through the fairgrounds, quiet at first, like wind stirring the stalks before a storm. By midnight, the sheriff's deputies had blocked the roads leading to the farms, and volunteers were forming lines at the edge of the maze. I joined them, holding a lantern borrowed from my father's shed. The smell of wet earth and gasoline filled the air. Every few yards, someone shouted Tyler's name, and the sound was swallowed by the corn. Flashlights danced through the fog, catching glimpses of scarecrows, boots half buried in mud, and once, a child's lost mitten that made a woman scream before realizing it was pink, not blue like Tyler's. The search stretched into the early hours, and the field began to feel endless. When the sun rose, we saw how far we had wandered. The maze sat between 3 farms, their property lines marked by rusted wire and piles of rotting hay. A man named Roger Jenkins brought coffee in a thermos and pointed to tire tracks near the drainage ditch. He said they were fresh, still pressed deep into the mud from the night before. The sheriff crouched beside them, tracing the pattern with a stick, and his face tightened. Word spread fast that the tread matched a pickup belonging to Tyler's neighbor, a quiet mechanic named Paul Hewitt. By noon, no one was talking about an accident anymore. The sheriff questioned Paul right there at the field, his wife standing behind him, arms folded tight against the morning chill. Paul kept saying he had gone home early, that his truck had not left the driveway since supper time. But everyone in town knew his tires. He used a distinctive snow tread year-round, claiming it gave him better traction in mud. While deputies searched his property, the rest of us stayed behind, combing through the maze row by row. Around mid-afternoon, one of the volunteer teams radioed that they had found a roll of duct tape half buried under a pile of stalks. It looked like it had been torn in a hurry, silver edges still sticky with dirt and grass. After that, everything changed. The fairgrounds that had been filled with chatter went dead silent, except for the sound of engines starting as more people joined the search. The duct tape was placed in a plastic bag and carried toward the sheriff's car like it was made of glass. A deputy muttered something about fingerprints and another pointed toward a broken flashlight lying a few yards away. Someone swore they had seen that same brand in Paul's garage last week. By then, everyone's face had turned pale, and whispers replaced words. It felt as if the entire town was holding its breath, afraid of what would come next. Later that evening, the sky turned a strange amber color, the kind you see before heavy rain. The wind made the corn hiss and shift, creating shapes that looked like people moving between the rows. We kept walking in lines, calling Tyler's name, but it started to sound meaningless. Some of the older men brought dogs, though the animals refused to go near the northern edge of the field. That was where we found the torn piece of blue fabric caught on a barbed wire fence. It matched the color of the hoodie Tyler had been wearing. The air around us felt heavy, and no one said a word as the sheriff wrapped it in another evidence bag. When night came again, the searchlights turned the field into a sea of shadows. The sheriff ordered everyone back to the fairgrounds to regroup, but a few of us stayed behind near the drainage ditch, where the tire marks had been found. That was when Roger noticed something in the water, a small silver chain tangled around a branch. It had a pendant shaped like a baseball, and Tyler's mother confirmed later that it belonged to him. The sheriff looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him. He said they would start digging near the ditch at first light. I went home that night muddy to my knees, but I could not bring myself to wash my boots. When dawn came, the air was thick with fog. Deputies marked off a wide area near the ditch and brought in shovels. A local news van arrived, its camera catching every movement. I stood behind the barrier tape with a few others, unable to leave. After about 20 minutes, one of the deputies called for the sheriff. They had uncovered something wrapped in a tarp, small, dark, and unmistakably human-shaped. The sheriff told the reporters to turn off their cameras, but everyone already knew. A woman behind me began sobbing, and someone else yelled that Paul should be dragged out of his house that instant. Paul was taken into custody that afternoon, though no one saw the evidence they had against him. His wife packed their belongings that same evening and drove away without saying goodbye to anyone. For a few weeks, the town lived in a fog of suspicion. Neighbors stopped talking to each other. Parents refused to let their kids walk alone, and even the church potluck was canceled. The sheriff said the investigation was still ongoing, but no charges were ever filed. People whispered that something about the evidence did not add up, that the tire marks might have been a coincidence. Still, no one dared to question the official story too loudly. Months passed, and the cornfields grew bare again. The festival was canceled the following year, replaced by a simple memorial service near the ditch. I stood there, watching the wind move through the dry stalks, and realized how quiet everything had become. It was not just grief. It was fear. Fear that someone still among us had done it. Fear that we might never really know. Sometimes when I drive past that field at night, I see flashlights flickering between the rows, like the search never ended. I know they are not real, but I still slow down and watch them until they fade. I have not been back since. The field was sold to a developer last spring, and they say new houses will be built where the maze once stood. People like to believe that time heals, but in our town it only buried what we could not face. Every autumn, when the air smells like wet hay and smoke, I think of Tyler, his blue hoodie, the pendant in the ditch, the silence that followed. None of us talk about it anymore, but every one of us remembers the night the search began, and the morning we wished we had never found what we were looking for. It happened during my senior year, after one of our late fall soccer practices. The days were already short, and by the time the bus left the school parking lot, the sky had that bruised purple color that means the sun is almost gone. There were 12 of us, plus our driver, Mr. Daly, a quiet man who always had an old thermos of coffee that smelled like burnt toast. Everyone was tired, still in our uniforms, our shoes muddy, music playing low from someone's speaker near the back. It felt like any other ride home, except for the route, a detour through a narrow road that cut between cornfields because of roadwork near town. About 20 minutes in, the engine made this coughing sound and the whole bus shuddered like it had hiccups. Mr. Daly tried to restart it, but after a few attempts it just went silent. The air inside turned heavy, no hum of the motor, only the whisper of wind against the windows and the tall corn brushing along the sides. He told us to stay put while he went to look for help, said there was a farmhouse not far down the road. He grabbed his jacket, stepped out, and the door's pneumatic hiss was the last clear sound before everything felt strangely hollow. We waited, maybe 10 minutes at first, then 20. The light outside kept fading until all we could see through the glass was the dull reflection of ourselves and a thin stripe of orange horizon. Someone cracked a joke about ghosts in the corn to break the tension, but it didn't land. One of the younger students, Ellie, started recording on her phone, trying to capture how creepy the field looked. Just rows of stalks waving in the wind. The video's still online, I think, but the last part is what got people talking. Because after the laughter faded, there were footsteps, not Mr. Daly's, slower, uneven, circling the bus. At first we thought maybe it was him, or someone from the farmhouse he mentioned, but when Ellie called out, there was no reply. Just that rhythm of steps shifting through the dirt, stopping, then starting again from a different side. The kind of sound that doesn't match any pattern you recognize. Someone tried to use their phone flashlight to look outside, but the glare bounced off the glass, and it only made things worse, like we were trapped in our own reflection. That was when we heard the first tap on the side panel, light but deliberate near the emergency exit window. The tapping came again, this time closer to where we sat. It was faint, like the tip of a coin against metal, but steady enough that no one spoke over it. Someone whispered that maybe the wind was moving the stalks, but there was no wind strong enough to make that sound. Then came a scrape, long, dragging, along the length of the bus. It traveled slowly, almost as if whoever or whatever was outside was testing each panel. A few of us stood up and tried to look through the windows on that side, but it was useless. The corn was too dense, and everything beyond the glass looked like shifting shadows. Ellie stopped recording when the sound reached the back door. Her phone light flickered once, and I remember her face going pale in that dim glow. Mr. Daly had been gone nearly 40 minutes by then. We tried to convince ourselves that he was just lost, that maybe he had gone the wrong way down the road. One of the older boys, Ethan, said we should go find him, but nobody wanted to step outside first. It was strange. None of us said we were scared, but nobody moved either. The silence between us said everything. At some point, a pair of headlights appeared far down the road, faint but real. Everyone rushed to the front thinking help had come, but the lights never got closer. They just hovered there, distant and still, like whoever was driving had stopped in the middle of the road. When they finally blinked out, it felt like the night got heavier. The air turned colder inside the bus, though none of the windows were open. I could smell something faint then, wet dirt and something like rust. That was when the footsteps returned, faster this time, circling again. But there were more of them, too many. It sounded like a crowd walking through the field just out of sight, moving in patterns that made no sense. The rhythm of it built until the sound was coming from both sides, and a low voice, maybe 2 or 3 of them, started whispering our names. Not all of us, just a few. Mine was one of them. No one said anything after that. We just sat there, waiting until someone at the back said they saw a light inside the corn rows. The light was small, maybe the size of a lantern, weaving between the stalks as if someone was carrying it low. We all crowded toward the windows, but the glass fogged with our breath. I remember wiping it clear with my sleeve and seeing the light stop halfway to the bus. Then another one appeared behind it, and another, 3 in total, flickering like weak flashlights. For a moment we were sure it was Mr. Daly bringing help, and the relief hit all at once, until one of the lights started moving upward, high above the corn, like it was floating. The other two stayed still. The laughter we expected never came. No voices. Just that steady shuffle of footsteps drawing closer again. Someone yelled that we needed to get out. Panic spread quick. Ethan pulled the emergency lever, and cold air rushed in with the smell of soil and something metallic. We climbed down one by one, our sneakers sinking into the soft dirt. The field surrounded us on every side, the corn towering higher than our heads. The bus lights flickered once behind us, then went dark. Nobody said a word after that. It was as if sound itself didn't want to exist out there. The only thing we could hear was breathing, ours, and something else pacing in rhythm just beyond the rows. When the police found me, it was already morning. I was sitting in the middle of the road, wrapped in one of those silver rescue blankets, staring at the spot where the bus had been. They said they found it a mile away. Engine still cold, door open, no one inside. Every other student was gone. The only thing left was Ellie's phone wedged under one of the seats. They played part of the last recording for me later. Those footsteps, the low whisper, and then what sounded like wind passing through the microphone before it cuts off completely. I wish I could tell you more, but I do not remember anything after running into the corn. To this day, no one has found the others, not even a piece of clothing or a footprint beyond the road. The official report says the bus rolled down a slope and got stuck, that the kids must have wandered off in confusion. But I still hear it sometimes when I drive past empty fields at dusk, the same rhythm of steps brushing through dry stalks, circling, waiting. The sound follows the car for a while, then fades when the light is gone. That night feels like it never ended, like part of me is still sitting on that bus, watching those three lights sway in the dark. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October in Colorado gets cold fast, especially up in the mountains where I'd been living since my divorce finalized earlier that year. I'd moved to Granite Falls after signing the papers in August. 33 and starting fresh seemed less pathetic in a place where nobody knew my history. The town had maybe 4,000 people, tucked between peaks that already had snow on them, and I'd rented a cabin about 20 minutes outside the main strip. That Saturday morning, I'd signed up for a trail cleanup event at Bear Creek Trail, one of those community service things I figured would help me meet people who weren't just the cashier at the grocery store or my landlord. The email from the Parks Department said to meet at 8 in the morning at the main trailhead. Bring work gloves if you had them, and they'd provide trash bags and those grabber stick things. I pulled into the gravel parking area around 7:45, counting maybe 15 cars already there. The volunteers stood in a loose circle near the information board, most of them wearing worn hiking boots and flannel jackets, holding steaming cups from their thermoses. I recognized a few faces from town. The woman who ran the bakery, a couple of guys I'd seen at the hardware store, an older man who walked his German Shepherd past my cabin sometimes. Everyone seemed to already know each other, laughing about something someone's kid had done at the school play, discussing whether we'd get early snow this year. I stood at the edge of the group, pulling my work gloves from my jacket pocket, trying to look busy while actually feeling completely out of place. That's when this guy approached me, probably mid-40s, wearing a bright orange vest like the ones road workers use, carrying a clipboard and giving me this huge, welcoming grin that made his whole face crinkle up. "First time volunteering with us?" he asked, and I nodded, grateful someone was actually talking to me. He introduced himself as Nathan, said he'd been organizing these cleanups for about 2 years, really passionate about keeping the trails beautiful for everyone. He had this way of talking where he'd lean in slightly, like whatever you were saying was the most interesting thing he'd heard all day, and he kept touching my elbow when he'd point out different trail sections on the map he pulled from his clipboard. Nathan explained we'd be split into groups of 4 or 5, each taking a different section of the trail system, and that he'd make sure to put me with some friendly folks since I was new. The weird thing was, when the actual Parks Department coordinator showed up, a woman named Carol wearing an official uniform with the Colorado Parks logo, Nathan just kept standing there next to me, still holding his clipboard, still wearing that orange vest that I noticed didn't have any official logos or badges on it. Carol gathered everyone together and started explaining the day's plan, pretty much repeating everything Nathan had already told me, except she divided us into groups of 3, not 4 or 5. She assigned me to work with the bakery owner, Janet, and her husband, Tom, pointing out that we'd be taking the lower loop near the river. Nathan wasn't on her list at all, but he just nodded along like he knew exactly what was happening, then told Carol he'd float between groups to help where needed, and she seemed fine with that, though I caught her giving him this quick look I couldn't quite read. We grabbed our supplies, trash bags, those grabber things, a bucket for any broken glass, and headed out onto the trail, Janet chatting away about how they'd been doing these cleanups since they moved here in 2009, asking me about my cabin, whether I'd survived my first real mountain thunderstorm yet. All this normal, small-town, friendly stuff that was actually starting to make me feel welcome. About an hour into the cleanup, we'd filled 2 bags with the usual stuff. Energy bar wrappers, water bottles, cigarette butts, even a busted camping chair someone had just left behind. Tom was telling this story about finding a whole tent full of empty beer cans last year when Nathan appeared on the trail ahead of us, coming from the direction we were heading, rather than from behind where the other groups were working. He waved us over, said he'd spotted what looked like a major dump site just off the trail, maybe 50 feet through the trees. Too much for one person to handle alone. Janet immediately said we should get Carol, that dump sites sometimes had hazardous stuff, but Nathan insisted it was just regular trash, probably from some college kids having a party, nothing dangerous, and he'd already started bagging it up but needed extra hands. Tom checked his watch and mentioned we should probably take our break anyway. Carol had said to meet back at the parking area at 10:30 for water and snacks, and it was already past 10. Nathan jumped on that immediately, his whole face lighting up like Tom had just given him the best idea. "Hey, if you're heading back for break anyway, I can show you a shortcut," he said, looking directly at me even though he was supposedly talking to all 3 of us. "There's an old service road that cuts straight back to the parking lot. Saves you probably 15 minutes versus going back the way we came. I use it all the time when I'm out here doing my own cleanup work." Janet started to say something about sticking to the marked trails, but Nathan was already pointing through the trees to the left, explaining how the old road connected to the back end of the parking area, right where the portable toilets were set up, and we could grab our snacks and be back before anyone even noticed we'd taken a different route. The way he kept focusing on me while he talked, like Janet and Tom weren't even there, made my chest feel tight in this way I tried to ignore. Told myself I was just being paranoid because I'd been alone too much lately. Tom actually seemed interested in the shortcut, started asking Nathan about whether it was the same service road they'd used to bring in equipment when they rebuilt the footbridge last spring. But Janet grabbed her husband's arm, said something about her knee acting up and needing to take the easier path back, the one they knew. Nathan's expression flickered for just a second, this flash of irritation that made him look completely different from the friendly volunteer helper he'd been playing all morning, before the big smile came back. He turned to me then, completely turned his back on Janet and Tom, and asked if I wanted to see the shortcut anyway. Said he could show me real quick while they headed back the long way, and we'd probably still beat them to the parking area. "Always good to know multiple routes," he said, already taking a few steps toward the trees. "Especially for someone new to the area. These trails can get confusing if you don't know all the little connections." I actually took a step toward him. Even now, writing this, I can't believe I actually took that step. Started to follow this stranger into the woods just because I didn't want to seem rude or unfriendly. But Janet spoke up, louder this time, almost sharp, saying, "She's with our group, Nathan. Carol assigned the groups for a reason." The way she said his name, with this edge to it, made me stop and really look at her face. Her expression was pleasant enough, still smiling, but her eyes were locked on Nathan with this intensity that made me suddenly very aware that we were pretty far from the parking area, pretty far from the other groups, and that nobody except Janet and Tom actually knew where I was right then. Nathan laughed, this easy, casual sound that didn't match the way his jaw had tensed up, and said sure, of course, he was just trying to be helpful, share some local knowledge with a newcomer. We started walking back the way we'd come, Janet keeping me between her and Tom, Nathan trailing behind us for a while before eventually disappearing off to the side, supposedly to check on another group. Janet kept up this steady stream of chatter about her bakery, asking if I'd tried her sourdough yet, telling me about the farmers market on Saturdays, normal stuff. But her hand stayed on my arm the whole walk back, gentle but firm, like she was making sure I stayed with them. When we got to the parking area, most of the other groups were already there, Carol passing out bottled water and granola bars from a cooler in her truck. I grabbed my water and walked over to thank Janet for showing me the ropes, and that's when she pulled me aside, glanced around to make sure nobody was close enough to hear, and asked me in this low, careful voice if Nathan had approached me before today, if I'd seen him around town, if he'd maybe been to my cabin. The question made my whole body go cold in this visceral way that finally broke through my polite social programming. I told her no, I'd never seen him before this morning, and asked what was going on, why she was asking. Janet exchanged this look with Tom, one of those married couple conversations that happens without words, before she told me that Nathan had been showing up to these cleanup events for about 6 months. Always had some reason to be there, but was never officially on the volunteer list. And 3 times now, young women who'd joined the groups had mentioned him making them uncomfortable, trying to separate them from others, offering to show them shortcuts or special spots along the trails. Carol had tried to tell him he needed to register properly if he wanted to volunteer, but he always had some excuse, some reason he was just passing through, just helping out. And since he'd never actually done anything they could report, they couldn't exactly ban him from public trails. I looked around the parking area then, scanning the groups of volunteers who were getting ready to head back out after break, but I didn't see Nathan anywhere. Neither did Janet when I asked her, and that seemed to worry her more than anything else. She grabbed Carol, pulled her over, and quickly explained that Nathan had tried to get me alone on some shortcut trail, and now he'd disappeared. Carol's face went tight, and she immediately did a head count, checking her clipboard against the people standing around, asking each group if everyone was accounted for. That's when we realized Melissa was missing. A young woman from Fort Collins who'd driven up for the event, probably 25 or 26, auburn hair in a ponytail, wearing a Colorado State University sweatshirt. She'd been working with the group on the upper trail, and her team leader said she'd mentioned needing to use the bathroom about 40 minutes ago, headed back toward the parking area where the portable toilets were, and they'd assumed she'd just gone straight to break afterward. Carol called Melissa's phone immediately, and we could all hear it ringing somewhere nearby, this cheerful pop song ringtone echoing from the woods behind the portable toilets, exactly where Nathan had said his shortcut came out. Tom and 2 other guys jogged over to look while Carol called 911, and they found the phone about 30 feet into the trees, lying in the dirt next to a dropped water bottle and 1 work glove. The screen was cracked but still working, and when Carol picked it up with a tissue to preserve any fingerprints, we could all see the text message that was typed but never sent, just sitting there in the message field. "He's not part of the team." The timestamp showed she'd started typing it 28 minutes ago. The police arrived within 15 minutes, benefits of a small town where nothing much happens, and they immediately started searching the woods, brought in dogs within the hour, but Melissa and Nathan were both gone, just gone, like they'd never existed. Except for that phone and that unsent warning that she'd tried to give someone, probably her friend who was supposed to pick her up later, before Nathan had stopped her from hitting send. The search went on for 3 days. They found Nathan's orange vest snagged on a branch near the river crossing about 2 miles from the trail, and Melissa's other glove further downstream, but nothing else. The police discovered Nathan's truck parked at a different trailhead 5 miles away, one that connected to the same trail system through those old service roads he'd mentioned. Inside, they found maps of the entire trail network, with handwritten notes about quiet spots and low traffic times, plus a notebook with descriptions of various women who'd attended previous cleanup events. Hair color, approximate age, whether they'd come alone, which cars they'd driven. My description was in there from that morning. New, divorced, cabin off Forest Road 7, white Subaru, isolated. The FBI got involved after that, connected Nathan to similar disappearances in Wyoming and Montana, always at volunteer trail events, always targeting women who were new to the area, always vanishing without a trace afterward. They never found Melissa. Her parents came down from Nebraska, stayed in town for 2 weeks, put up posters everywhere, but eventually they had to go home with nothing but questions. The theory was that Nathan had some kind of hideout in the backcountry, maybe an old mining cabin or cave system, somewhere he could disappear to when things got hot. The police searched every structure in a 20-mile radius, used helicopters with thermal imaging, brought in cave specialists to check the old mines. But the mountains up here are vast and full of places where someone who knows the terrain could hide forever. What haunts me most is thinking about those 40 minutes between when Melissa left her group and when we realized she was gone. She must have run into Nathan near the toilets, maybe recognized him from the morning meeting, thought he was safe because he was wearing that official-looking vest, and followed him just far enough into the trees for him to reveal who he really was. Just like I almost did, except I had Janet watching out for me, and Melissa had nobody. I moved out of Granite Falls 2 months later, not because anyone blamed me or treated me differently, but because I couldn't drive past that trailhead without thinking about how close I'd come, couldn't see the mountains without wondering if Nathan was still up there somewhere, watching, waiting for things to calm down so he could come back with a different name, different vest, same friendly smile. Janet helped me pack, and on my last day she told me something that still gives me nightmares. About a month before the cleanup event, she'd seen Nathan at the grocery store, standing near the community bulletin board where I'd pinned a note about looking for hiking buddies since I was new to town. He'd been taking a photo of it with his phone. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time, just figured he was interested in hiking too. But now she wondered if that's how he'd known to target me, if he'd been planning it for weeks, researching where I lived, when I'd be alone, how isolated my cabin was. The FBI agent I spoke with before leaving said they'd linked Nathan to at least 7 disappearances across 3 states over 4 years. Always the same pattern, always women who were new to the area or visiting, always at organized outdoor events where he could blend in as a helpful volunteer. They never caught him. Sometimes I check the news from Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, looking for reports of missing hikers, and every time I see one, I wonder if it's him with a new name, new vest, new hunting ground. But what really keeps me awake at night is knowing that I survived purely by chance, because Janet happened to be protective, because Tom happened to mention the break at the right moment, because something in Janet's voice made me stop walking toward those trees. Melissa probably had those same instincts, probably felt that same chest-tightening worry, but she didn't have a Janet, and that text she tried to send, "He's not part of the team," was her trying to be her own warning system, trying to protect herself or maybe warn others, and it wasn't enough. It's never enough when they know the terrain better than you, when they've had months to plan, when looking helpful is their camouflage. October in our town meant one thing, the annual fall fair that everyone pretended was better than it actually was. I'd been running the ring toss booth for my uncle since I turned 16, and now at 23, I knew every vendor, every security guard, and every inch of that muddy field we called a fairground. That Saturday started like any other, with me hauling stuffed animals from my uncle's van while the morning fog still clung to the grass. The Ferris wheel creaked its familiar protest as workers tested it, and the smell of funnel cake already hung thick in the air, even though we wouldn't open for another 2 hours. I remember joking with Beverly, who ran the cotton candy stand next to us, about how we'd probably see the same faces we saw every year. The Brennan family with their matching flannel shirts, old Harold who'd spend all day at the beer garden, and the groups of teenagers who thought they were too cool to be there but showed up anyway. The afternoon crowd picked up around 2, and that's when I first noticed her. Not because anything seemed wrong, but because she was helping a little kid who dropped his corn dog in the dirt. She couldn't have been more than 17, wearing one of those oversized hoodies that kids like these days, the purple one with the high school mascot on it. She bought the crying kid a new corn dog with her own money, and I remembered thinking that was pretty decent of her. Maybe an hour later I saw her again with a group of friends near the Gravitron, all of them laughing and filming each other trying to eat caramel apples without getting it all over their faces. Normal teenage stuff, you know? The kind of thing you see 100 times every fall fair and don't think twice about. But something made me keep noticing her throughout the day. Not in a creepy way, just one of those things where once you see someone, you keep spotting them in the crowd. Around 5:30, when the sun started painting everything orange and the air got that perfect October bite to it, I noticed her again, but this time she was alone. She stood between the corn maze entrance and the row of food trucks, typing on her phone with this intense focus, her face all scrunched up like she was worried about something. That's when I saw him for the first time. Baseball cap pulled low, plain gray jacket. Nothing special about him except the way he was standing. He was by the churro stand, maybe 20 feet from her, holding a cup of something but not drinking it, just holding it. When she moved toward the lemonade truck, he moved too, keeping that same distance. When she got in line, he suddenly found something very interesting to look at on the prize board at the basketball game right next to the lemonade truck. The way he moved wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated, like he was playing some kind of game only he knew the rules to. I had a line of customers then, families wanting to win giant teddy bears, so I had to focus on my booth. But between customers, I kept glancing over, and each time, he was there, always that same distance from her, always pretending to be interested in something else. She'd moved to the kettle corn stand, and he was examining the menu at the BBQ place next door. She walked toward the portable restrooms, and he suddenly needed to throw something in the trash can nearby. The girl kept checking her phone, typing fast, and at one point she looked around quickly, like she was trying to spot someone in the crowd. Her whole body language had changed, shoulders hunched, walking faster, not stopping to look at anything anymore. I wanted to say something, do something, but what? Walk up to her and say, "Hey, that guy might be following you." What if I was wrong? What if he was just some dad waiting for his kid or something? You always think you'll know exactly what to do in these situations until you're actually in one. Then she did something that made my chest tighten. She ducked behind the funnel cake truck and just stood there, pressed against the back of it, peering around the corner. The man in the baseball cap had stopped too, standing by the ring toss game across from my booth, still holding that same cup he'd been carrying for at least 20 minutes now. He was scanning the crowd, methodical, his head moving slowly from left to right. When he didn't see her, he actually walked the entire perimeter of the food truck area, passing right by where she was hiding. She waited until he was on the opposite side before she darted out, heading toward the edge of the fairgrounds where the exhibitor parking was. But here's what made everything worse. As soon as she moved, he turned around like he'd been expecting it, like he knew exactly what she'd do. He didn't run after her, didn't even walk fast. He just followed at that same steady pace, confident, like someone who knew exactly where this was heading. I finally couldn't stand it anymore and called out to Larry, our security guy who usually hung around the beer garden. Told him there was something weird going on with some guy following a teenage girl around. Larry, who was probably pushing 70 and moved about as fast as you'd expect, said he'd take a look but had to go break up some argument at the pig races first. By the time I looked back, the girl was already at the far end of the fairgrounds, near where the exhibitor trucks and employee vehicles were parked. The man had picked up his pace now, closing the distance between them. She was practically jogging, her purple hoodie making her easy to track even in the growing shadows between the vehicles. The last clear view I had was her weaving between two livestock trailers, and him following maybe 30 seconds behind. After that, the crowds, the trucks, and the fading lights swallowed them both. I kept watching that area, waiting to see her come back, telling myself she probably just found her parents' car or met up with friends. But she never came back through the main area. About 10 minutes passed, and I was getting more anxious by the second. I asked Beverly to watch my booth and started walking toward the parking area myself, but it was chaos over there. Hundreds of cars, trucks with horse trailers, RVs, all crammed into a field with barely any lighting. I walked up and down a few rows, calling out, asking if anyone had seen a girl in a purple hoodie, but most people were either inside their vehicles or already heading back to the fair. Then I heard it, a truck engine starting up, that distinct diesel rumble. Through the maze of vehicles, I caught a glimpse of a black pickup truck moving without headlights on, navigating between the rows. It was moving slow and careful, like whoever was driving didn't want to draw attention. The weird part was that everyone else had their lights on. It was getting dark enough that you needed them, but this truck crept through the shadows like it was trying to stay invisible. It reached the exit onto the access road, and only then did the lights flicker on, just as it turned onto the main road and accelerated away. I ran back to find Larry, and this time I wasn't taking no for an answer. Found him by the cotton candy stand, told him we needed to call the real police right now, that I'd seen this girl being followed and now she was gone, and there was this truck that left with no lights on. Larry actually listened this time, maybe because of how panicked I must have looked. He radioed the fair coordinator, and within minutes, we had 2 sheriff's deputies there. I told them everything, about the girl in the purple hoodie, the man in the baseball cap, how he'd followed her to the parking area, the black truck leaving without lights. They took it seriously, started asking specific questions. Did I know who she was? Had I seen either of them before? Could I describe the man better? Problem was, I'd been so focused on his behavior that I hadn't really studied his face. Average height, average build, that gray jacket and baseball cap, probably somewhere between 30 and 45. Could have been anybody. The deputy said they'd checked the security cameras and started walking around asking other vendors if they'd seen anything. That's when things got really bad. About 20 minutes later, while I was still talking to one of the deputies, a woman came running up to us, completely hysterical. She was looking for her daughter, Ashley, 17 years old, supposed to meet her at the main entrance at 7 but never showed up. When the deputy asked what she was wearing, the woman pulled out her phone, showing us a photo from earlier that day, purple hoodie with the school mascot on it. My whole body went cold. The deputy's expression changed completely, and he immediately got on his radio, calling for backup and asking someone to review the security footage right away. The mother kept saying Ashley always answered her texts, always, and she'd sent one message at 6:40 saying some creep wouldn't leave her alone, then nothing. She showed us the text. Mom, this guy in a baseball cap won't stop following me between the food stands, coming to the car. That was it, the last thing she ever sent. Within an hour, the whole fairground was swarming with police. They shut down all the exits, started checking every vehicle trying to leave, interviewing everyone they could find. They pulled the security footage from the 3 cameras they had, one at the main entrance, one by the ride ticket booth, and one overlooking part of the parking area. The footage was grainy and mostly useless, but that last camera caught something. At 6:52, you could see Ashley walking alone toward the back section of the parking area, moving fast. 6:53, a figure in what looked like a baseball cap following the same path. 6:54, nothing, just empty frame. Then at 6:56, a black truck pulling out from that same area, driving slowly with no lights until it hit the access road. They couldn't get a clear shot of the license plate. The angle was wrong and the quality was too poor. But that timestamp matched exactly with when I'd seen that truck leaving. The detective who talked to me later said that 2-minute window between the man following her and the truck leaving. That was everything. Whatever happened, it happened fast. They found her phone the next morning in the parking field, screen cracked, tossed under a livestock trailer about 50 feet from where I'd last seen her. There was blood on the gravel nearby, not much, but enough. The forensics team spent hours going over that whole area, but overnight rain had washed away most of whatever evidence might have been there. The really sick part was that he must have planned it all, knew exactly where the cameras were and weren't, knew the lighting was bad in that section, knew there'd be enough chaos and noise that nobody would hear anything. The police interviewed over 200 people who were at the fair that night. 3 other teenage girls came forward saying they'd noticed a man matching that description hanging around them earlier in the day, making them uncomfortable enough that they'd stayed in groups. One girl, Kayla, said he'd asked her for directions to the parking area around 4 o'clock, but something about the way he smiled when he asked made her lie and point him toward the opposite end of the fairground. She said his teeth were too white, like those fake veneers people get, and he had this smell like cigarettes covered up with too much cologne. Details that haunt you afterwards, wondering if you could have done something different. They never found Ashley. They never found the truck either, even though the police put out an alert across 3 states. The FBI got involved after a week, connected it to 2 other similar disappearances at county fairs in the past 3 years. Same pattern. Teenage girl alone, man in a baseball cap, vehicle leaving the scene right after. They think he scouts the fairs during the day, picks his target, waits for the right moment when they're separated from their group. Patient, methodical, invisible in the crowd of ordinary people just trying to enjoy their day. I quit working at the fair after that. Actually, I quit a lot of things. Moved back in with my parents, started seeing a therapist who says survivor's guilt is common even when you weren't the direct victim. But I can't stop replaying that day, seeing all the moments I could have done something different. Should have left my booth, approached her directly, walked her to security myself, gotten a better look at his face, memorized that truck's license plate. The fair still happens every October, but I don't go. Beverly told me they added more cameras and hired real security guards now. Not just retirees looking for extra cash, but Ashley's still missing. And somewhere out there, that man in the baseball cap is probably walking through another crowd, holding another cup he's not drinking, watching. The fog had gotten so thick on Interstate 84 through Oregon that I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. And after 16 hours of hauling refrigerated goods, my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd been driving trucks since my divorce papers got finalized in 2011, and at 41, I figured I'd seen every weird thing these highways had to offer. The dashboard clock showed 2:47 a.m. when I spotted the Cascade View Rest Area sign emerging from that thick soup of white. My bladder had been screaming for the past hour, and the coffee thermos I'd drained somewhere around Baker City wasn't helping. The parking lot lights were mostly off when I pulled in, which should have been my first warning. Only one sodium lamp flickered near the main building, casting these long, distorted shadows across the empty spaces. Construction barriers lined half the lot, and a sign reading "Closed for renovation, no facilities available" stood crooked against some orange cones. This was supposed to be October peak travel season, but the place looked like it had been abandoned for months. But that single restroom light glowing through the fog, right there in the men's room window, told a different story. Maybe the construction crew left it on, or maybe they kept one bathroom operational for emergencies. Either way, my options were limited to either using that bathroom or pissing in a bottle in my cab like some rookie. I grabbed my flashlight from the door pocket and killed the engine. The silence hit different out here. Not peaceful, but heavy, like the fog was swallowing every sound before it could travel. My boots crunched on loose gravel as I walked toward that lone light, passing abandoned construction equipment and stacks of concrete barriers. The door handle felt colder than it should have, even for an autumn night, and when I pushed it open, The hinges screamed like they hadn't been touched in weeks. Inside, the fluorescent light buzzed and flickered, giving everything this sickly, greenish tint. The renovation hadn't reached this bathroom yet, but it looked rough. Cracked tiles, rust stains running down from the faucets, and that smell of old bleach mixed with something else I couldn't place. 3 stalls lined the left wall, all with their doors hanging slightly open except the middle one, which was shut tight. A backpack sat on the floor next to the sinks, one of those expensive hiking types with all the straps and clips. Strange thing to leave behind, I thought, walking closer to check it out. The main compartment hung open, and right there on top of some crumpled clothes sat an iPhone, propped up against the fabric. The screen was still on, still recording video, the red recording button blinking at the top. My first instinct was to call out, ask if anyone was there, but something about the setup made me pause. The phone's battery showed 12%, and the recording timer read 3:47:23. Almost 4 hours of continuous recording. Who leaves their phone recording for 4 hours in an abandoned rest stop bathroom? I picked it up carefully, trying not to smudge any fingerprints in case this was some kind of crime scene. The video showed mostly darkness with occasional glimpses of the bathroom ceiling when someone must have adjusted the phone's position. I started scrubbing backward through the footage, watching shadows move in reverse, until I hit something that made me stop breathing. There was a person in frame, someone wearing a baseball cap pulled low, standing in front of that closed middle stall. The timestamp showed 11:14 p.m., which meant this happened just a few hours ago. The person in the video stood perfectly still, just facing that stall door like they were waiting for something. Then they knocked. 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed in the empty bathroom. A voice came from inside the stall, muffled but clearly terrified, saying something I couldn't quite make out. The person with the cap tilted their head, listening, then reached into their jacket pocket. They pulled out what looked like a long, thin piece of metal, maybe a coat hanger that had been straightened out. They slid it through the gap between the door and the frame, working it around like they knew exactly what they were doing. The whole time, whoever was in that stall kept talking, pleading, their voice getting higher and more desperate. After about 30 seconds of working that metal piece, there was a click, and the stall door swung open from the outside. The video got shaky after that, like whoever was holding the phone, probably the person in the stall, had started panicking. But in those last few seconds before the recording angle went wild, I saw the person with the cap step into the stall, saw them reaching forward with both hands, and then the phone must have fallen, because suddenly it was just showing the backpack's interior. The audio kept going though, shuffling sounds, something being dragged across the tile floor, and then footsteps walking away. After that, nothing but the buzz of the fluorescent light for the next 3.5 hours. I looked at that middle stall, still closed tight, and noticed something I'd missed before. There were scratch marks on the tile floor leading from the stall to the main door, like something heavy had been dragged out. My brain kept trying to process what I'd just watched while my body stood frozen in that bathroom. The smart thing would be to get back to my truck, call 911, and let the cops handle this. But something made me walk toward that middle stall, maybe the same stupid curiosity that makes people slow down at accident scenes. The door was locked from the inside now, which didn't make sense given what I'd seen in the video. I got down on my knees, angled my flashlight under the gap, and immediately wished I hadn't. There were dark stains on the floor, still wet, and something white that looked like a broken fingernail. But what really got me was the smell coming from under that door. Metallic and thick, the kind that sticks to the back of your throat. I stood up fast, maybe too fast, because I knocked into the sink and sent the backpack sliding across the floor. That's when I heard it, a phone ringing, but not the iPhone I was holding. The sound was coming from inside the closed stall, a cheerful default ringtone that felt completely wrong in this place. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then stopped. The silence that followed felt alive somehow, expectant. Then a text message sound pinged from inside the stall. Another ping, then another. Someone was trying to reach whoever had been locked in there. I backed toward the door, still holding that iPhone with its dying battery, when I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, crunching across the gravel. They stopped right outside the bathroom door. The handle started to turn just like in the video, except this time I was the one trapped inside. The door began to open, and through the gap, I could see the outline of someone wearing a baseball cap. I didn't think, just reacted, throwing my full weight against the door and slamming it shut. The person on the other side stumbled back, and I heard them hit the gravel hard. My fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, finally getting it locked just as they started pounding on the door. Not knocking like in the video. This was violent, desperate hammering that made the whole frame shake. They weren't saying anything, which somehow made it worse. Just that relentless pounding while I stood there, trying to figure out my next move. The bathroom had no windows, no other exit. My truck keys were in my pocket, but my truck was 50 feet away through that fog, and whoever was outside stood between me and it. The pounding stopped suddenly, and I heard footsteps moving away, circling around the building. They were looking for another way in. I grabbed the backpack, shoved the iPhone inside, and tried to think. The person knew this place, knew about the renovation, probably knew every possible entrance. Then I remembered the construction equipment outside. There had to be tools, maybe something I could use to defend myself. The footsteps had moved to the back of the building now, and I could hear metal scraping against metal. They were trying to pry open a service door or ventilation grate. I turned off my flashlight and stood in the flickering green light, listening to them work. That's when the lights cut out completely. The electrical box, I realized. They'd killed the power. In the absolute darkness, I heard that service door finally give way with a shriek of bent metal. They were inside the building now, somewhere in the walls or ceiling, moving through the renovation areas. I could hear them crawling through the space above, tiles shifting and creaking under their weight. I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before they found a way to drop down into the bathroom. In the pitch black, I felt my way along the wall to the door, unlocked it as quietly as I could, and slipped outside. The fog hit me like a physical thing, so thick I could barely see my own feet. But I knew my truck was straight ahead, maybe 50 feet through the construction zone. I started moving, trying to remember where the barriers were, where the equipment sat. Behind me, I heard a ceiling tile crash down inside the bathroom, followed by the thud of someone dropping to the floor. They'd realize I was gone in seconds. I picked up my pace, stumbling over something metal that clanged loud enough to wake the dead. Sure enough, the bathroom door burst open behind me, and I heard those footsteps again, faster now, coming straight for me. My hand finally found the cold metal of my truck's door handle, and I yanked it open, practically falling inside. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the fog to reveal a figure standing just 10 feet away. Not running anymore, just standing there in that baseball cap, head tilted like they were studying me. I threw the truck in reverse, tires spinning on the loose gravel, and got the hell out of there. As I pulled onto the highway, I grabbed my CB radio with shaking fingers and called in an emergency to any trucker or cop who might be listening. 20 minutes later, I met 2 state troopers at a gas station and led them back to the rest stop. We found the bathroom exactly as I'd left it. The backpack, the phone still recording though, now dead. The scratch marks, the blood. But when they finally got that middle stall open with bolt cutters, it was empty except for more blood and a wallet belonging to someone named Brandon Hewitt. The cops took everything as evidence, launched a whole investigation. They found Brandon's car abandoned 5 miles up a service road, but never found Brandon himself or whoever took him. The detective assigned to the case called me a few weeks later, with an update that made my skin crawl all over again. They'd recovered the full video from the iPhone, including deleted segments from earlier in the evening. Brandon had been documenting his solo hiking trip, talking to the camera about the trails he'd explored that day. In one clip from around 9 p.m., he mentioned stopping at the rest area despite the construction signs because he desperately needed a bathroom. But here's what really got me. In the background of that video, barely visible in the corner, there was someone already there, sitting in a van in the far corner of the parking lot. Just sitting there in the dark, waiting. The police enhanced the image and found something else. Construction equipment in the van's back window that matched tools stolen from a work site 40 miles away. Whoever this person was, they'd been using closed rest stops as hunting grounds, knowing travelers would still stop despite the warnings, knowing they'd be isolated and vulnerable. I don't drive that route anymore. Switched to a completely different corridor, even though it adds 3 hours to my deliveries. The cops never found the person in the baseball cap, never found Brandon, never even identified who was driving that van. They put out warnings, increased patrols at rest stops, but nothing ever came of it. Sometimes I wonder if that person is still out there, maybe at a different rest stop, maybe with a different method, just waiting in the dark for someone desperate enough to ignore a closed sign. I kept a copy of one frame from that video, the one where you can just barely make out the figure standing by my truck as I drove away. Something about their posture, the way they just stood there watching me leave. It wasn't disappointment or anger. It was patience. Like they knew there would be others, knew there always would be. And the worst part? They were probably right. Every night, someone somewhere pulls into an empty rest stop, sees that one light still on, and decides to risk it. Every small town in Michigan has that one farmer's market where locals sell honey, vegetables, and homemade soap. And ours on Birchwood Road was no different. I'd been managing a coffee shop downtown since graduating with my photography degree, 24, and still trying to figure out if I'd made the right choice. Jenna had been my closest friend since freshman year of high school. She was the one who dragged me into that first photography class, insisting I had an eye for composition even when I couldn't see it myself. That Saturday afternoon, we were helping her younger sister with an environmental science project about seasonal changes in local ecosystems. Behind the market, there was this incredible stretch of woods where the maple trees turned burnt orange every fall, perfect for the shots we needed. We'd been planning this for weeks, waiting for the leaves to hit that perfect point between green and brown. The afternoon started out completely normal, almost boring even. We'd been there since around 2, taking macro shots of decomposing leaves, fungi growing on fallen logs, and the way afternoon light filtered through the canopy. Jenna was lying flat on her stomach, trying to get the perfect angle on some mushrooms growing at the base of an oak tree, while I was adjusting my tripod near a cluster of ferns about 20 feet away. The market was winding down for the day. We could hear vendors packing up their trucks in the distance. That familiar sound of wooden crates being stacked and truck doors slamming. The woods felt peaceful, just the occasional rustle of squirrels gathering acorns and the distant hum of the highway beyond the tree line. I remember checking my phone and seeing it was almost 4:30, thinking we should probably wrap up soon before we lost the good light. That's when Jenna stood up, brushing dirt off her jeans, and grabbed my arm with this strange expression on her face. "Don't look right away," she whispered, her fingers digging into my forearm harder than necessary. "But there's someone watching us, behind the big elm tree maybe 40 yards back." Her voice had this forced calm to it, like when you're trying not to scare a child, but I could feel her trembling slightly. I kept fiddling with my camera settings, pretending to review the shots on my LCD screen while slowly angling myself to get a better peripheral view. At first, I thought maybe it was just another photographer or someone from the market taking a walk. But then I saw him. A man in dirty brown work boots and what looked like a canvas jacket, crouched low between 2 trees, holding something up to his face. The way he was positioned, completely still except for the slight movement of his hands adjusting whatever he was holding, made every nerve in my body start firing warning signals. I forced myself to laugh at something on my camera screen, nudging Jenna like we were just looking at photos together. "Pack up naturally," I said through my smile, keeping my voice light and steady. "We're leaving right now." We started gathering our equipment with deliberate casualness, me collapsing my tripod, Jenna zipping her camera bag, both of us fighting the urge to run. The whole time I kept stealing glances toward where the man was positioned, and that's when I realized what he was holding: binoculars. Heavy, military-style binoculars that he had trained directly on us. The woods suddenly felt different, like all the ambient sounds had dropped away except for our own movements and breathing. Even the vendors at the market seemed impossibly far away now. As we walked back toward the parking area, maintaining that forced normal pace, I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere behind us, closer than where he'd been before. We made it to Jenna's car, a beat-up blue Subaru with too many bumper stickers, and the second the doors closed, she locked them and started the engine in one motion. "Should we call someone?" she asked, her voice shaking now that we could drop the act. I was already dialing 911, my fingers fumbling with the phone screen. While the phone rang, I kept watching the tree line, and that's when I saw him again. He'd moved to the edge of the woods, just standing there in the shadows between the last row of trees and the gravel lot. The operator answered, and I tried to explain what happened without sounding paranoid. But how do you describe that particular flavor of fear when someone's been watching you? The woman on the line said she'd send an officer to check it out, took our information and told us to wait in a safe location. Jenna drove us to the front of the market where there were still people around, and we sat there with the engine running, watching the rearview mirrors. Officer Daniels showed up about 15 minutes later, a younger guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on a Saturday evening. We walked him back to where we'd been shooting, Jenna and I staying close together while pointing out the exact spots. I expected him to brush us off, maybe suggest it was just a bird watcher or someone hiking, but his demeanor changed when he saw the disturbed undergrowth where the man had been crouching. There were clear boot prints in the soft earth, and a worn path that led deeper into the woods, like someone had been going back and forth regularly. Officer Daniels radioed for backup, telling us to stay by his patrol car. Within 20 minutes, there were 3 more officers and a detective named Reeves, a woman with sharp eyes who asked us to describe every detail we could remember. They formed a line and started moving through the woods systematically, their flashlights cutting through the growing dusk. About 200 yards in, one of the officers called out, and everyone converged on a small clearing hidden behind a thick cluster of evergreens. Jenna and I couldn't see much from where we waited, but we watched Detective Reeves emerge from the tree line, her face grim, speaking rapidly into her radio. She called for crime scene techs and more units, using codes I didn't understand, but that made Officer Daniels, who'd stayed with us, go pale. "We need you both to come to the station," Reeves said when she reached us, her tone professional but urgent. "We've found something significant." During the ride there, she wouldn't tell us what they'd discovered, but I could see her jaw clenching and unclenching in the driver's seat. At the station, they separated Jenna and me into different rooms, where I spent 3 hours going over every second of our encounter with different detectives, describing the man's clothing, his approximate height and build, the exact timeline of events. It wasn't until Detective Reeves came back around 9 that night that I learned what they'd found. She sat across from me with a folder of photographs, her expression careful and controlled. "We discovered a campsite," she said, spreading out pictures of a small tent covered with camouflage netting, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, along with several cell phones, wallets, and driver's licenses. She showed me photocopies of the IDs, 3 women and 1 man, all between 20 and 35, all from towns within a 50-mile radius. I recognized one of the names, Claire Hoffman, from news reports about a missing hiker from the previous month. My throat went completely dry as she explained that these were all people who'd been reported missing over the past year, their cases previously unconnected. The campsite had a portable camp stove, canned goods, and disturbingly a journal filled with detailed observations about people who visited the woods, including dates, times, physical descriptions, and license plate numbers. Detective Reeves flipped through more photos, showing me pages from the journal, though she kept most of the content covered with her hand. What I could see made my skin prickle. Neat, cramped handwriting describing people's routines, which days they typically came to the market, who they were usually with. One entry from 3 weeks earlier mentioned 2 young women with cameras, early 20s, brown and blonde hair, artistic types, with our exact arrival and departure times from a previous scouting trip Jenna and I had made. We hadn't even noticed anyone that day, had felt completely alone in those woods. The detective explained they'd found evidence suggesting the man had been living out there for at least 6 months, maybe longer, moving his camp periodically but always staying within the same half-mile radius. The most disturbing part was a plastic storage container buried near the tent, wrapped in garbage bags, that contained personal items clearly taken from different people. A distinctive turquoise ring, a medical alert bracelet, a wallet with the cash removed but all the cards and photos still inside. They kept us at the station until almost midnight, going through missing persons files, asking if we recognized any other names or faces. Jenna's parents came to pick her up around 11, but I drove myself home, taking the longest route possible to avoid passing anywhere near Birchwood Road. The detective said they'd launched a massive search for the man, that they had his DNA from items in the camp, his fingerprints from the journal, but somehow he'd vanished completely by the time they'd started looking. They theorized he'd been somewhere nearby, watching the entire police response, and had simply melted away into the network of woods that stretched for miles beyond the market. What haunts me most is that final detail Reeves mentioned almost offhandedly. In the journal's most recent entry, dated that very morning, he'd written about planning to make contact with his next subjects, that he was tired of just watching, that today felt like the right time to introduce himself properly. The search went on for 3 weeks. They brought in dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging, even volunteer search teams from surrounding counties, but they never found him. The farmers' market shut down temporarily while they combed every inch of those woods, and when it reopened a month later, they'd cleared a 100-foot buffer between the market and the tree line, installed motion sensor lights, security cameras, the works. Detective Reeves called me about 2 months after everything happened to tell me they'd connected the items in the tent to 4 missing persons cases, but they still had no idea who the man was, no matches in any database, no missing person report that fit his description. The truly unsettling part was that when they analyzed the journal more thoroughly, they found he'd been documenting visitors to those woods for at least 2 years. Hundreds of entries about different people, their habits, their vulnerabilities, notes about who came alone, who seemed distracted, who would be easy to approach. They arrested someone about 8 months later, a drifter they picked up 3 states over who matched our description, but it wasn't him. Jenna was so sure at first, but when we went to identify him through the one-way glass, we both knew immediately it was wrong. The eyes were different, the way he held himself, everything. The real guy, the one from the woods, had this stillness about him, like a spider waiting in its web, perfectly patient. This wasn't him. The case went cold after that, though Detective Reeves assured us they'd keep it open indefinitely. Jenna moved away the following year, said she couldn't drive past that market without feeling sick. I still live here, still manage the same coffee shop, but I've never gone back to those woods. Sometimes customers mention hiking back there, taking their kids to pick wild blackberries in the summer, and I want to grab them, tell them what we found, warn them about what might still be out there, but I don't. I just suggest other places they might enjoy more, places with better trails, better berries, better anything to keep them away from those trees where someone once sat watching, writing, waiting for the perfect moment that, thank God, never came for us. The morning air had that November bite that makes you pull your jacket tighter, and I remember checking my watch, 5:45, as Duke pulled me toward the park entrance. I'd been walking that same route through Riverside Park for maybe 6 years, ever since my divorce papers got finalized and I moved into the townhouse on Walnut Drive. Duke, my golden retriever, knew every tree, every bench, every spot where the squirrels like to hide. That particular morning started like any other, except for the car parked by the eastern tree line with its engine running and headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. A silver sedan, one of those generic four doors you see everywhere, positioned oddly between two oak trees where there wasn't really a proper parking spot. The exhaust fumes drifted white in the cold air, and I could hear the low rumble of the engine from 50 feet away. Duke wanted to investigate, naturally, but I kept him on the path because whoever was in that car probably wanted privacy. Maybe someone having a rough night, or catching a few minutes of sleep before work. The windows were fogged up from the inside, and I couldn't make out anyone through the condensation, though the driver's seat looked occupied from the angle I had. I finished our usual loop, about 40 minutes total, and noticed the car hadn't moved an inch. Still running, still glowing in the darkness. By the time Duke and I headed home, the sky was starting to lighten to that pale gray that comes before sunrise, and I figured whoever it was would be heading out soon. I made breakfast, showered, had my usual 2 cups of black coffee while reading the news on my tablet, and completely forgot about the car until I had to run to the hardware store around 10 that morning. The quickest route to Hanson's Hardware cuts right through the park, so I decided to walk instead of drive, maybe grab a coffee at the place on 3rd Street afterward. The silver sedan was still there. Same exact spot, same position between those 2 oaks, but now the engine was off and the headlights were dead. The driver's door hung wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. From where I stood on the path, I could hear something playing from inside. That harsh, crackling sound of radio static turned up too loud. The windows had cleared of condensation, and I could see straight through to the passenger side. Empty. The driver's seat was pushed back all the way, like someone really tall had been sitting there, and there was a coffee cup in the center console, steam still rising faintly from it in the cold air. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to process what I was seeing, because none of it made sense. People don't just abandon their cars with the door open and the radio blasting static. I walked closer, slowly, calling out a "hello?" That came out quieter than I intended. No response. The static kept crackling, oscillating between frequencies like someone had been scanning through stations and just left it between channels. Could see a wallet on the dashboard, brown leather, thick with cards, and a phone face down on the passenger seat. A jacket was draped over the back of the driver's seat, one of those expensive wool coats you see downtown professionals wearing. The coffee cup was still half full, and when I got close enough, I could see the liquid was barely lukewarm, maybe an hour or 2 old at most. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing broken. Just an abandoned car with all the owner's belongings still inside, like they had simply vanished mid-sip. I pulled out my phone and called 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher, who seemed more concerned when I mentioned the personal items left behind. 2 patrol cars showed up within 15 minutes, and I watched from a nearby bench as the officers examined the scene. They ran the plates, tried the phone, it was locked, and carefully bagged the wallet. One officer, a younger guy with a notebook out, came over to ask me questions. When exactly had I first seen the car? Was anyone else around? Did I touch anything? I told him everything about my morning walk, how the car had been running for hours with someone possibly inside, and how I'd found it like this on my way to the hardware store. He wrote it all down, occasionally glancing back at his partner who was on the radio, probably running the owner's information from the registration. The officer's partner, an older woman with sergeant stripes, walked over with a concerned expression that made my chest tighten. She asked me to describe again exactly what I'd seen that morning, specifically about whether I was certain someone had been in the driver's seat. I explained about the fogged windows, the angle of my view, how I couldn't be completely sure but it looked occupied. She nodded slowly, then told me the car belonged to a Jason Whitmore, age 41, an insurance adjuster from Fairview Heights about 20 minutes away. His wife had called him in missing when he didn't come home from what was supposed to be a quick evening drive to clear his head. That was yesterday evening, which meant the car had been running in that spot for over 12 hours, maybe more, before I first saw it. The timeline made even less sense now. Why would someone sit in an idling car all night, then disappear right when the park started getting foot traffic? They brought in a K9 unit around noon, a German shepherd named Rex, who immediately picked up a scent from the driver's seat. The dog led his handler straight from the car toward the tree line, nose to the ground, tail rigid with focus. About 30 yards into the woods, Rex stopped at a fallen log and started circling, whining in that way police dogs do when they've found something significant but confusing. The handler called for the sergeant, and they spent several minutes examining the area. I couldn't see what they were looking at from where they had me wait, but I heard one officer radio for additional units and mention something about unusual ground disturbance. They started stringing up yellow tape between the trees, expanding the perimeter, and that's when they told me I needed to leave the scene but to stay available for follow-up questions. I gave them my contact information and walked home the long way, avoiding the park entirely, my mind racing through possibilities. The local news picked up the story by evening. Local man vanishes from park, investigation ongoing. But they had even less information than I did. I couldn't stop thinking about that coffee cup still steaming in the cold. Jason Whitmore had been sitting in that car, drinking coffee, probably listening to the radio, and then just... what? Got out and walked into the woods? But why leave everything behind? Why leave the door open and the radio playing? I learned from the news report that he had no history of mental illness, no financial troubles, no reason to disappear. His wife described him as a devoted father of two, steady and predictable, the kind of man who called if he was going to be 10 minutes late. The reporters interviewed a few people at the park, including Mrs. Grayson, who walked her poodles there every morning. And she mentioned seeing the car too, said she'd noticed it because the headlights were so bright they hurt her eyes when she passed. 3 days passed before the police called me back. Detective Angela Foster wanted to meet in person, said she had some follow-up questions about what I'd observed. We met at the station, in one of those small rooms with uncomfortable plastic chairs and fluorescent lights that hum just loud enough to be annoying. She pulled out a file thick with papers and photographs and asked me to look at something. The photos showed the area where the dog had stopped, that fallen log and the ground around it. In one picture, I could see what looked like drag marks in the dirt, leading from the log deeper into the woods. Another photo showed Jason Whitmore's shoe, a brown Oxford, found about 50 yards from where the dog lost the scent. Just one shoe, the left one, laces still tied. Foster asked if I'd seen anyone else that morning, any other cars, anyone on foot near the woods. I hadn't, and I told her so, but then I remembered something that seemed insignificant at the time. There had been a maintenance van in the park parking lot when I'd arrived that morning, one of those white vans with no windows in the back and a ladder on top. I'd noticed it because it was parked crooked, taking up 2 spaces, and it had mud splattered all up the back doors even though it hadn't rained in over a week. The detective's expression changed when I mentioned this, and she asked me to describe everything I could remember about the van. I couldn't recall any company name or logo, just that it was white, dirty, and had that ladder. She wrote everything down, then showed me another photograph. This one was from a traffic camera on Riverside Drive, time-stamped at 4:17 that morning. A white van, no visible plates, turning into the park entrance. 23 minutes before I arrived for my walk. Foster explained they'd found similar tire tracks near where Jason's shoe was discovered, and they were trying to trace all white vans registered in the county, but without plates or distinguishing marks, it was slow going. Detective Foster then told me something that made my whole body go cold. They'd found evidence of at least 3 other similar incidents in parks across the state over the past 8 months. Same pattern every time. A car found running or recently abandoned. Personal items left behind. The owner vanished without a trace. 2 of the cases had similar tire tracks nearby, possibly from the same or similar vehicle. The victims had nothing in common. Different ages, genders, professions, cities. The only connection was that they'd all been alone in isolated areas during early morning or late evening hours. She said they were working with state police now, treating it as a possible serial abduction case. They'd analyzed Jason's coffee cup and found traces of something unusual. Not a drug exactly, but a compound that could cause disorientation and muscle weakness, if inhaled in concentrated amounts. The theory was that someone had been watching these people, waiting for them to be alone and vulnerable, then somehow introducing this substance into their vehicles, maybe through the ventilation system, while they sat there unaware. The investigation went on for weeks, but they never found Jason Whitmore or the white van. His family held a memorial service after 3 months with no leads, no body, no answers. I stopped walking in the park after that, started driving to a gym across town instead. Every time I see a white van now, especially those without windows, my heart races, and I find myself checking the plates, looking for mud on the doors, watching to see where it goes. Detective Foster called me one last time about 6 months after Jason disappeared to tell me they'd connected 2 more cases to the pattern, but still had no solid leads. She thanked me for my help and said they'd be in touch if anything developed. That was 2 years ago now, and I still think about that morning sometimes, about the coffee steam rising in the cold air, about how Jason Whitmore was just trying to clear his head with a drive and ended up becoming another unsolved case. The park reopened after a few months, and people walked their dogs there like nothing happened, but I know some of them remember, especially the early morning regulars who now walk in groups, never alone, always watching the tree line and checking the parking lot for white vans that don't belong. Coach Bryant kept us late that Thursday, running penalty kicks until our legs felt like rubber and the field lights had to come on. I remember jogging down Sycamore Avenue afterward with my cleats bouncing against my backpack, thinking about the geometry test I hadn't studied for yet, and whether Mom had made her famous Thursday night lasagna. The neighborhood was settling into that quiet hour when everyone's inside starting dinner, and I could smell wood smoke from someone's fireplace mixing with the wet leaves that covered most of the sidewalks. My 13th birthday was coming up the next month, and I was already planning my argument for why I deserved a new phone, practicing the speech in my head as I walked the familiar 20-minute route home from school. Every house along Sycamore looked warm and lived in, porch lights beginning to glow, except for the Brenner place. 3 stories of rotting wood and broken dreams that had been sitting empty since before we'd moved here 5 years ago. The realtor sign had fallen over so many times they'd finally just removed it, and now the house just sat there, making everyone walk a little faster when they passed by. That evening changed everything though, because as I was doing my usual quick walk past the property, trying not to look at the overgrown hedge that had swallowed half the front gate, I caught movement in the second-floor window facing the street. A person was standing there, about 3 feet back from the glass, completely motionless like they were watching something specific down below. The failing light made it hard to see details, but I could make out a tall frame wearing what appeared to be a long, dark coat, maybe navy or black, with their arms hanging straight down at their sides in this weirdly formal way. My first thought was that someone had finally bought the place and was probably measuring for curtains or checking out the view, so I did what any polite kid from the suburbs would do. I raised my hand in a friendly wave. The figure didn't acknowledge me at all, didn't even shift their weight or turn their head slightly, just continued that perfect stillness that made my neck prickle for reasons I couldn't explain. Friday's practice ended at the same time, and I found myself oddly anxious as I approached the Brenner house on my walk home. Part of me expected to see a moving truck or some sign of life, maybe contractors' vehicles or a dumpster for renovation debris, anything that would explain yesterday's visitor. But the place looked exactly the same. Dead grass, paint curling off the siding like old scabs, and that rusty mailbox with its door hanging open at a broken angle. I slowed down as I got closer, pretending to adjust my backpack straps while really scanning the windows for any sign of movement. The late afternoon sun hit the glass at a different angle than the day before, and I could see straight through most of the first floor. Nothing but empty rooms and what looked like water stains spreading across the ceiling. Then my eyes traveled up to that second-floor window, and there they were again. Same exact spot, same dark coat, same unnaturally rigid posture. This time I stopped completely, standing right there on the sidewalk to get a better look, and I noticed something that made my throat go dry. The person's hands were perfectly aligned with the seams of their coat, fingers pointing straight down like a soldier at attention, but their head was tilted at this subtle angle that suggested they were looking directly at me. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes, having this bizarre staring contest with someone whose face I couldn't quite make out, before my courage cracked and I practically jogged the rest of the way home. The logical part of my brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a security guard checking on the property, or someone from the bank that probably owned it doing inspections. But security guards move around. They check different rooms. They don't stand in the exact same position in the exact same window at the exact same time 2 days in a row. That night at dinner, I pushed my food around my plate while Mom talked about her day at the dental office where she worked, and Dad scrolled through his phone reading news articles out loud, and I kept almost saying something about the Brenner house but couldn't figure out how to explain it without sounding like a paranoid kid. Finally, when Mom asked why I wasn't eating much, I just said practice had been really tough and excused myself to do homework, even though I spent most of the time looking up the Brenner house online, finding nothing except a few old real estate listings from 2012 with photos that showed empty rooms and descriptions about great potential and perfect for renovation. The weekend gave me a break from walking past the house, but I couldn't stop thinking about that figure in the window. Saturday morning, while Mom drove me to my friend Kevin's house, I made her take Sycamore Avenue instead of our usual route, claiming there was construction on Oakwood Drive. As we passed the Brenner place, I pressed my face against the car window trying to see up to the second floor, but the angle was wrong, and the sun's glare made it impossible to tell if anyone was there. Mom didn't even glance at the house, just kept talking about how she'd run into Kevin's mother at the grocery store, and how they were thinking of putting in a pool next summer. I wanted to ask her if she knew anything about the Brenner house, who owned it, why it had been empty so long, but something held me back. Maybe because I knew she'd want to know why I was asking, and I wasn't ready to explain that I'd been seeing someone in there who stood frozen like a department store mannequin for exactly 1 hour every evening. Monday came too fast, and as I sat through practice, I kept checking the sky, watching the sun sink lower, calculating whether I could convince someone's parent to give me a ride home instead of walking. But when Coach Bryant finally blew his whistle and everyone started packing up, I knew I had to see if the pattern continued. My teammate Oliver lived roughly in my direction, and I walked with him for the first 10 minutes, talking about the upcoming game against Riverside Middle. But when we reached the corner where he turned off toward his street, I was alone again. The Brenner house loomed ahead, and this time I noticed something new before I even got close. The porch light was on. Not the weak, flickering kind of light you'd expect from an old bulb that someone forgot about, but a strong, steady glow that made the peeling paint and broken railing look even worse by comparison. I slowed my pace, counting my steps, trying to delay the moment when I'd have to look up at that window. And when I finally did, my whole body went cold despite the sweat from practice still drying on my skin. The figure was there, but this time they weren't alone. There was another person standing in the window directly beside them, wearing an identical dark coat, maintaining that same perfect stillness with their arms pressed against their sides. 2 of them now, both facing the street, both positioned exactly 3 feet from the glass, their heads tilted at precisely the same angle like they'd been arranged by someone obsessive about symmetry. The new person was shorter, maybe 5'8" compared to the original 6 feet, but everything else about their posture and positioning was disturbingly identical. I actually took a step backward into the street, nearly getting clipped by a passing minivan whose driver honked and yelled something I didn't process, because I couldn't look away from those windows. The worst part was that even with the porch light illuminating more of the house's facade, I still couldn't make out their faces, just dark shapes where features should be, like someone had taken an eraser to their heads and left only shadows. My brain scrambled for explanations: mannequins, cardboard cutouts, some kind of weird art installation. But deep down, I knew these were real people because I could see the subtle rise and fall of their chests, barely perceptible, but definitely there, proving they were breathing, alive, waiting. I ran the rest of the way home, my backpack slamming against my spine with each stride, and burst through our front door so hard that Mom dropped her coffee mug in the kitchen. She rushed over asking what was wrong, if someone had chased me, if I was hurt, and I just stood there panting, trying to figure out how to explain what I'd seen without sounding completely insane. Finally, I told her everything. The figure in the window, how they appeared every day at the same time, and now there were two of them, just standing there watching the street. Mom's face went through several expressions, from concern to confusion, to something that looked almost like recognition, and she made me sit down at the kitchen table while she called Dad to come home from his office early. While we waited, she kept asking me specific questions. Was I sure they were real people? Had they ever tried to communicate with me? Had I seen them anywhere else? And her voice had this careful quality, like she was trying not to scare me more than I already was. Dad arrived within 20 minutes, still wearing his work clothes but with worry lines creasing his forehead. And Mom repeated everything I'd told her while I sat there nodding and adding details when she missed something. They exchanged these meaningful looks that parents do when they think kids aren't paying attention. And then Dad said we were all going to take a drive to the Brenner house right now, together, to see what was going on. The sun had already set by then, and as we pulled up to the curb across from the house, the porch light was still glowing strong, casting weird shadows through the overgrown bushes. Dad told us to stay in the car while he walked up to the front door, and I watched him climb those creaky steps, his silhouette brave against that harsh light, before he knocked 3 times on the door that I was certain nobody would answer. He waited maybe 30 seconds, knocked again louder, then walked around the side of the house with his phone flashlight on, disappearing from view while Mom reached back to squeeze my shoulder. When he came back 5 minutes later, his face was pale and he was already dialing someone on his phone, speaking in a low, urgent voice to whoever answered about needing a patrol car at the Brenner house immediately. While we waited for the police, Dad got back in the car and locked all the doors, which he never did in our neighborhood, and told us that the back door had been forced open recently. The wood splintered around the lock. He'd looked through the windows with his flashlight and seen sleeping bags, food wrappers, and bottles scattered across the floor of what used to be the living room, clear signs that people had been staying there. The police arrived in 2 squad cars, and we watched from our car as 4 officers entered the house with their flashlights sweeping through the darkness, their radios crackling with static and coded messages I couldn't understand. They were inside for what felt like forever but was probably only 15 minutes, and when they came out, they were escorting 3 people, 2 men and a woman, all wearing those long dark coats I'd been seeing in the window, their faces gaunt and expressionless as they were guided into the patrol cars. One of the officers, a woman with sergeant stripes, came over to talk to my parents, explaining that these were homeless individuals who'd been squatting in the abandoned property, and from what they could tell, they'd been watching the neighborhood kids walking home from school, timing their routines, though she couldn't say exactly why. The sergeant mentioned something that still gives me chills when I think about it. They'd found notebooks in the house filled with detailed schedules of when kids passed by, physical descriptions, which houses they entered, even notes about which ones walked alone versus in groups. The 3 people weren't talking much, she said, but they seemed to be part of some group that believed watching children during what they called transition hours would reveal something important, though what exactly remained unclear. They'd been living in the house for about 2 weeks, taking turns standing in that window during the after-school hours, maintaining their strange vigil with a dedication that bordered on religious devotion. The woman they arrested had told one officer that they were documenting patterns, but wouldn't elaborate on what that meant or what they planned to do with the information. Mom pulled me closer as the sergeant talked, and I could feel her trembling slightly, probably thinking the same thing I was, that I'd been walking past those watching eyes every single day, becoming part of their bizarre documentation without knowing it. The police said they'd be increasing patrols in the area, and that the city would finally be boarding up the Brenner house properly, with proper locks and security measures to prevent anyone else from getting in. For weeks after that night, Mom drove me to and from practice, making excuses about errands she needed to run anyway, though we both knew the real reason. The Brenner house got boarded up as promised, thick plywood covering every window and door, with bright orange "No Trespassing" signs posted all around the property, and eventually the city put up a chain-link fence around the entire lot. I never found out what happened to those 3 people, whether they went to jail, got psychiatric help, or just moved on to watch children from some other abandoned house in another neighborhood. Sometimes I still think about them standing in that window, perfectly still, counting us as we passed like we were birds migrating south or cars on a highway, trying to divine some meaning from our daily routines that the rest of us couldn't see. The house was finally demolished the following spring, and now there's just an empty lot there with tall grass and wildflowers, though I still walk on the opposite side of the street when I pass by, unable to shake the memory of those dark silhouettes arranged so precisely in the window, watching and waiting for reasons I'll probably never understand. Teaching English in a small Polish village wasn't exactly what I'd pictured doing after finishing my master's degree, but here I was, 6 months into a language exchange program about an hour outside Krakow. The village had maybe 2,000 people, most of them elderly farmers or young families who commuted to the city for work. That Monday evening in November started like every other weekday, conjugating verbs with bored teenagers, stopping at the only restaurant that served food past 7 for some potato and cheese pierogi, then heading to my landlady's house to pick up Buddy. Pani Nowak had broken her hip 2 weeks earlier, and since her daughter lived 3 hours away in Warsaw, I'd volunteered to walk her golden retriever twice a day. Buddy was this gorgeous, calm dog who never pulled on the leash and always waited patiently while I fumbled with my keys in the dark. The arrangement gave me something to do besides scroll through social media in my tiny apartment, and honestly, having a dog around again made the whole foreign experience less lonely. My usual route with Buddy took us through the newer part of the village, past identical brick houses built in the 80s, but that night he had other plans. The moment we stepped outside, he started pulling toward the old cemetery road, this narrow path that ran between the church and the eastern cemetery wall. The main road through our village connected everything important: the school where I taught, the church with its oxidized copper spire, the small market that closed at 6, and behind the church, the cemetery that seemed to go on forever. I tried steering Buddy toward our regular direction, but he planted his paws and whined, something he never did. The street lamps from the main road threw just enough light onto the cemetery path that I could make out where we'd be walking. Since it was only about 8:30 and other dog walkers were probably still out, I let Buddy lead the way. The second we turned onto that narrow road, everything felt colder, quieter, like the sounds from the main street couldn't quite reach us anymore. The path itself was maybe 4 feet wide, pressed between the church's old stone wall on one side and the cemetery's iron fence on the other. Through the fence bars, I could see rows of headstones, some dating back to the 1800s according to what locals had told me, their surfaces covered in moss and lichen that looked black in the darkness. The smell changed immediately once we entered. Wet leaves mixed with something sharper, almost metallic, that made me wrinkle my nose. Buddy had stopped whining completely now, moving forward with this intense focus I'd never seen from him before. His ears were perked up, his whole body rigid with attention as he led me deeper down the path. The cemetery gate was about 60 meters ahead, and even from a distance, I could tell someone was standing there. At first, I thought maybe it was the groundskeeper or Father Wojciech checking on something. But as we got closer, I realized this person was too tall, too still, wearing clothes that didn't match anyone I knew from the village. The man stood perfectly motionless beside the cemetery gate, dressed in a long gray coat that nearly touched the ground. His posture was strange, completely rigid, arms at his sides facing the gate but not trying to open it, just standing there like he was waiting for something, or someone. In the weak light that filtered through from a distant street lamp, I could see he had thin, dark hair that hung past his collar, and his face was turned slightly away from us. What really made me want to turn around immediately was how Buddy reacted. The dog went completely stiff, planted his feet, and let out this low, continuous growl that vibrated through the leash into my hand. Buddy loved everyone, literally everyone, from the grumpy man who ran the market to the kids who sometimes pulled his tail. But here he was, warning me about this stranger in a way that made every instinct scream at me to leave. I started backing up slowly, keeping Buddy's leash tight, but then the man moved. Not toward us, thank God, but he raised one hand and pressed it flat against the cemetery gate, fingers spread wide like he was feeling for something through the metal. That's when I noticed the items arranged on the ground around his feet. Several white candles placed in a semicircle, though none were lit, and what looked like rope coiled in a specific pattern I didn't recognize. A dark canvas bag sat open beside him, and I could see tools inside. Definitely a small shovel, some kind of pry bar, and other things I couldn't identify in the dim light. The whole setup looked deliberate, ritualistic even, like he was preparing for something that required specific steps and equipment. He kept his hand pressed against the gate and I heard him speaking, not loudly, more like murmuring or chanting in a language that definitely wasn't Polish or English, something with harsh consonants that seemed to catch in his throat. My phone was in my pocket, but I was terrified that any movement might draw his attention fully toward us. Buddy's growling had gotten louder, more aggressive, and he was pulling backward now, trying to get us away from the man, which was all the encouragement I needed. We backed up faster, my eyes still locked on the stranger, watching as he moved his hand across the gate in slow, deliberate motions, almost like he was drawing invisible symbols on the metal. Then he reached down into his bag and pulled out what looked like a glass jar, filled with something dark, liquid or powder, I couldn't tell, and began pouring it along the base of the gate. The smell that reached us was awful, like rotten eggs mixed with something chemical that burned the inside of my nose. That's when I finally turned and ran, Buddy racing beside me, both of us sprinting back toward the main road like our lives depended on it. Behind us, I could hear the man's voice getting louder, the foreign words echoing off the church wall, but I didn't look back until we reached the pool of light from the street lamps. Once we hit the main road, I didn't stop running until we reached Pani Nowak's house, my lungs burning and legs shaking from the sprint. I fumbled with the gate latch, practically threw Buddy into the yard, and locked it behind us before collapsing on the front steps. Part of me wanted to call the police right then, but what would I even say? That I saw a creepy guy standing by the cemetery with some candles and rope. They'd probably think I was just another paranoid foreigner who'd watched too many horror movies. Plus, my Polish wasn't great when I was calm, and right now I could barely form coherent thoughts in English. I decided to wait until morning, maybe talk to Father Wojciech first since it was his church's cemetery. I brought Buddy inside, gave him extra treats for being such a good guard dog, and tried to convince myself that what I'd seen was just some local tradition I didn't understand, maybe someone visiting a grave in their own peculiar way. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak of my old apartment building, checking the locks on my door 3 times before finally crawling into bed around 2 in the morning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's pale hand pressed against the gate, remembered that terrible smell, heard those guttural words that sounded more like cursing than praying. When my alarm went off at 6:30, I actually felt relieved that the night was over. I got ready for work mechanically, trying to push the whole incident out of my mind, telling myself it would seem less frightening in daylight. But when I walked to school that morning, taking the long way to avoid the cemetery road completely, I saw 2 police cars parked outside the church and yellow tape blocking off the entrance to that narrow path. My heart started racing again as I watched officers walking in and out, their faces serious, some of them taking photos of something I couldn't see from where I stood. I stood there frozen for probably 5 minutes watching the police activity before Marta, one of the other teachers at school, came up beside me and grabbed my arm. She looked pale, almost sick, and immediately started talking in rapid Polish before remembering to switch to English for my benefit. Someone had tried to dig up one of the old graves during the night, she said. The grave of some wealthy merchant from the 19th century who'd been buried with his jewelry, according to local legend. The groundskeeper had found the scene early this morning when he came to unlock the cemetery for elderly parishioners who liked to visit graves before morning mass. But it wasn't just the attempted robbery that had everyone shaken. It was how the person had tried to do it. The police had found exactly what I'd seen the night before. Melted candles arranged in a perfect semicircle, rope tied in intricate knots around the iron fence posts, and strange symbols drawn on the gate with what turned out to be a mixture of sulfur and coal dust. The worst part, Marta whispered while glancing around nervously, was what they found inside the partially dug grave. The coffin had been pried open just enough to reach inside, but whoever did it hadn't taken anything. Instead, they'd left something behind. She wouldn't tell me exactly what, just shook her head and muttered something about old superstitions and things better left buried. The police were calling in specialists from Krakow, she said, people who dealt with cases involving what she called unusual circumstances. I wanted to tell her about what I'd seen, about the man in the gray coat, but my throat felt tight and the words wouldn't come. She must have noticed something in my expression because she squeezed my arm harder and asked if I was feeling all right. If I'd heard anything strange last night since my apartment was only a few blocks away. I just shook my head, mumbled something about needing to get to class, and walked away on unsteady legs. I taught my classes that day in a complete fog, going through the motions while my mind kept replaying what I'd witnessed. During lunch break, I finally worked up the courage to approach one of the police officers still at the scene, a younger guy who looked less intimidating than the others. In my broken Polish mixed with English, I managed to explain that I'd been walking my landlady's dog the previous night and had seen a man near the cemetery gate around 8:30. His whole demeanor changed immediately. He called over his supervisor, pulled out a notebook, and started asking detailed questions. What did the man look like? Tall, thin, long gray coat, dark hair past his collar. Did I see what he was doing? Setting up candles, rope, had tools in a bag. Did he see me? Maybe. His head turned slightly, but he didn't follow us. They exchanged meaningful looks when I mentioned the strange language he'd been speaking, something that sounded ancient and harsh. Definitely not any European language I recognized. They caught him 3 days later, trying to break into another cemetery 2 villages over, using the exact same method. The candles, the rope patterns, the sulfur mixture on the gates. Turned out he was part of some group that believed old graves contained not just treasures, but specific items needed for their rituals, things that had been buried with the dead for protection or punishment centuries ago. The police never did tell me what he'd left in that merchant's coffin, but Father Wojciech had the entire cemetery blessed twice that week, and locals started leaving fresh flowers and crosses at the violated grave every single day. I finished out my teaching contract, but I never walked past that cemetery after dark again. And even now, years later, whenever I smell sulfur or see candles arranged in a circle, I remember that night and the way Buddy knew, just knew, that we needed to run.